Is this running or not? I don't know. Does anyone hear anything yet? Okay, it should be running now. Is this running or not? I don't know. Whoa. Okay. Does anyone hear anything yet? Alright. Hopefully the echo will stop in a second. There seems to be a bit of a delay between what I'm saying and when it comes through, but that will be okay. Okay, it should be running now. Let me silence both of my streams. There we go. Okay, so I just like to be able to check on both. Okay. Now I think we're good. Welcome to the official Successors tier ranking video. I've been working on this for a little while. It's been a while since I've looked at the Successors, so I had to reacquaint myself with a lot of what they did. And there are still a couple of them where I don't recall all the details, but I have a long series covering all the people we're talking about today, so you can find that information by typing in the name of someone you're interested in, then typing in my username, Thersites the Historian, and what you're looking for should pop right up. As you can see here, I had to get relatively creative when it came to creating representative images. Many of the people featured in this list were not famous enough to get their own coin or to inspire somebody on DeviantArt or whatever to draw them. So, yeah, I had to use a little bit of creative license here and there. Okay. So what I tried to do is divide the 36 successors I'll be covering into various categories based on their geographical location. For the most part, I have tried to exclude the second or third generation people. So for instance, we're not going to be talking about Antigonus II. We're also not going to talk about Antiochus I, even though there's a better case to be made for him than Antigonus II. We will be talking about Pyrrhus. He actually seized the throne at one point, so I guess that's a pretty good achievement. And we will talk about a few other people who maybe aren't entirely obvious. We'll be talking about Zapoites of Bithynia. We'll talk about Philoterus of Pergamon, and others. So let's get this started. First, we'll do the category of the ladies of the successor period. I thought about adding Phila, the daughter of Antipater and wife of Craterus and Demetrius, but she didn't quite make the cut for this one. However, in the absence of Phila, there's only one woman to start with, and that is Alexander's mother, Olympias. You might imagine that as a royal herself, Olympias felt that she should have quite a bit of say in the politics of Macedon while her son was on the throne. However, she and the regent Antipater were bitter foes, so that rarely happened. She had retreated to Epirus, her native country, before Alexander's death. After his death, she bided her time for a bit and waited until she had a chance to help out Alexander's posthumously born son, Alexander IV, and then she tried to assert herself. Olympias, by this point, was probably in her mid-50s or so. However, she still commanded a ton of respect, even as a foreign queen among the Macedonians, because her son had become more or less a living god by conquering the known world. When she shows up in Macedon at the head of her little Epirote army, the men on the Macedonian side cannot bring themselves to fight against Alexander's mother, and they just defect en masse. And that will lead to the defeat and death of one of the people we'll talk about in a minute, who had quite a bold career of her own before that happened. However, Olympias, for all of her prestige, was not necessarily a very good politician. She could prove to be very vengeful and also domineering, so she had aligned herself with Polyperchon in the war that he was fighting with Cassander. She basically took over everything, sidelined Polyperchon as a political decision maker, and started purging the court of her enemies. And because she was a foreign queen in Macedon, she was on thin ice to begin with. and this means that she quickly made a lot of enemies, and she alienated her supporters. She then formed up a strategy with Polyperchon and Aristobulus, which made no sense. They divided their army into 3 parts, and so Cassander was able to defeat them in detail. And also, she decided to hole up in a coastal city of, I think it was Pydna, without sufficient supplies. And without the supplies, of course, her army starved out pretty quickly, and that then put Alexander IV and Roxanne in the hands of Cassander, who, of course, later had them executed. As for Olympias herself, she was put to death around, I believe it was, I forget what year right offhand, but at any rate, it's not a surprising outcome given what she had done. Rating her is a bit tricky. She had a great position, but she didn't use it terribly well beyond the initial moves. I have to give Olympias a D. And keep in mind, when I'm rating these people, I might talk about what they did under Alexander, but the ratings are based entirely on what they did as successors, just to be as clear as possible on that. Next up is Olympias' daughter and Alexander's full sister, Cleopatra. Here I used an image of Cleopatra VII, the famous Egyptian queen, or Ptolemaic queen, I guess you could say. But Alexander's sister Cleopatra was also an important figure in the successor period, and the reason you might not have heard of her is because she is one of the better examples of wasted potential. At the time when her brother died, Cleopatra was maybe 31 or 32 years old, and she already had had a couple of children, so she had proven fertility. She also had experience as a ruler. After her husband Alexander of Epirus had died in battle in Italy, she had served as a regent for a period of time at home, so she had administrative experience. So she was quite a catch, and also could legitimately help someone govern, while lending a ton of legitimacy. She also seems to have been a little bit more easygoing than her mother, but just as ambitious. A couple of the authors I've read who have tried to talk about this period assume that she was something of a cipher for her mother Olympias, but I think that's a very unfair judgment. So Cleopatra effectively was the ultimate and quickest path to legitimacy. She also probably knew a lot of these guys going in, since a lot of the generals weren't much older than Alexander, and Cleopatra was only a tad younger, so they'd probably met at some point. And her strategy was to marry someone who was a major player. Her first choice for husband was Leonitus, who had been this great hero of the later parts of Alexander's campaign. And as we'll see when we get to him, some people considered him sort of a taller, more handsome version of Alexander. And Leonitus took on all the characteristics of Alexander after his death, like the head tilt and all that stuff. And then he was going to marry Alexander's sister, so the thing got a little weird, but we have to keep in mind that this was about power, so it's maybe not as perverse as it might seem at first blush. So Cleopatra doesn't get to marry Leonitus because he's killed in action during the Lamian War. And then she decides to move to Sardis to be closer to some of the other major generals. She's not able to get with Craterus because Craterus gets married to Antipater's daughter Phila. Otherwise, Craterus would have been probably the best person in the entire empire to marry at that moment because he was very popular with the troops and very well respected by pretty much everybody. So she moves to Sardis, and now she's looking at Perdiccas, the regent, as a potential husband. And they sort of waffle on this, and Perdiccas delays at first because he also is engaged to one of the daughters of Antipater, and of course Antipater is someone you have to keep happy, but he sees the potential of Cleopatra, so he's trying to play for time. But then, after the war breaks out against Perdiccas, the first war of the Successors, Cleopatra gets cold feet, and she essentially says, "You need to win this war before I marry you." He loses the war, so now it's 320 or so, she's stranded at Sardis, and for whatever reason she doesn't move from the city, even though there's no evidence that she was under any compulsion And then in 319, Antigonus takes over as general of Asia, and he immediately sees the threat posed by Cleopatra marrying one of his younger colleagues, especially one of the guys who's an ex-bodyguard. So he puts her under house arrest for the next 12 years, and that is Cleopatra's career. There's clearly a lot of potential there, and in my Patreon-only video that I'm working on, Cleopatra has a much more interesting career. This is an alternative successor scenario. But in real life, her career is pretty disappointing. I have to go with an E. I think her fundamental strategy was solid, but she executed it poorly. Not to mention that her life was also pretty depressing. She had children back in Epirus. And she also would have heard news about her mother's capture and execution, and then the execution of her young nephew, Alexander IV. So she lived to see all of that happen, and there was nothing she could do about it. So, pretty tragic life in many ways. Next up is one of the more interesting figures of the entire successor period, which is saying a lot, given that the successors are pretty much all fascinating people, whatever else you might say about them. Adia, who later became Queen Eurydice II. So, as many of you know, Alexander had a half-brother who was developmentally disabled, named Aridaeus, who later became Philip III. And Philip III was unmarried. Philip II had had many marriages, and he had produced a lot of daughters. One of them was Cunani, who at this point was in her mid to late 30s, and she had a teenage daughter, and she decided to travel to Sardis, where Philip III was residing, and have her daughter Adia, who was about 15 or 16, marry Philip III, and thereby become queen. Obviously, Perdiccas, who was planning to marry Cleopatra at some indefinite point, wasn't a big fan of this. He sent his brother Alcitus to intercept them, and what broke out was a street battle between Cunani, Adia, and their attendants versus the troops under Alcitus. And the thing you have to remember about both Cunani and Adia is that both of them were raised in Illyria, and they grew up in a warrior tradition. The reason why I put Xena here is because Xena is from that same geographical area in the show, and it's very much in line with the historical tradition of Illyrian women being warriors. Cunani is killed, which is one of the great things which helps to undermine Perdiccas' legitimacy and create the First War of the Successors. Also, Adia is captured and then still manages to marry Philip III as sort of a face-saving measure on Perdiccas' part, and he thinks that because she's a teenager with no experience, she'll be easy to control. He was very, very wrong about that. After Perdiccas is killed in Egypt, the new guardians, Python and Attalus, are completely unable to control the young queen, who now just starts to do what she wants. After all, she is a granddaughter of Philip II, and she's got a crown on her head, so why shouldn't she? She's the only functional adult who's in that situation. Alexander IV is still an infant. Philip III, as I mentioned, is developmentally disabled, so Adia is making a lot of demands. And she then teams up, not with Attalus, Aridaeus. Aridaeus was the other guardian. Sorry, I messed that up. Attalus was a rogue general at this point with the treasury. He arrives at the Triparadises conference and starts handing out gold on Adia's behalf, and she's trying to whip the men up into a frenzy to murder Antipater. And she nearly pulls this off, but somehow Antigonus and Seleucus get the mutiny under control, and they make peace with Adia, who, by the way, is now Eurydice II. So, all that's fine, and then she and Philip III go to Europe. And here she's trying to rule in her own right at some point. She is an ally of Cassander, whereas Olympias sides with Polyperchon once they fight a civil war after Antipater's death. All of the royals were brought back to Europe. And Adia, as this great warrior princess, thinks that she will be able to lead the Macedonian army into battle because that was the custom of her people. So she's riding at the head of her troops, trying to inspire her men to go crush Olympias and the Epirotes. And she forgot a couple things. One, the Macedonians don't have the warrior princess tradition, so they don't care. And two, you're talking about the mother of Alexander. So her men deserted her, and then she was captured, and Olympias had her put to death, along with her husband. And because she was a daughter of Philip II, this did leave a sour taste in some people's mouths, but it was mostly Olympias's further murders after Edea that turned people against her. If you really look at what Edea had to accomplish at such a young age, and without her mother there to really help her when it mattered the most, I'm very impressed with what she accomplished, and the fact that she was really able to make these very experienced successor generals sweat. I'm going with the B for Edea. I think that she did a lot with the position that she had, and had Olympias been a little bit less legendary, or I should say if her son had been a little bit less legendary, there's no telling what Edea could have pulled off. Next up, and the last of the women successors, is Craterus. She also came from a fairly obscure station to achieve some pretty impressive stuff. And if anything, I think that she's actually the most impressive of the women successors. Growing up, people realized early on that she would one day be a very beautiful woman. And her father was a general named Melgar. I don't think he's the same Melgar from Babylon, but rather some general who had stayed behind in Macedon and was probably relatively minor. But he advertised his daughter around and also made sure that she was very well educated in politics, because his idea was to marry her up the social hierarchy to advance the family fortunes. And he was able to do just that. When Polyperchon came back to Europe, he also had a son, Alexander. And it's easy to forget now, but Polyperchon was a huge deal for a short period of time. He took over Antipater's station as general of Europe. So Meleager and Polyperchon made a deal where Craterus married Alexander. So now she was very well positioned, basically the daughter-in-law of the general of Europe. However, Alexander, son of Polyperchon, betrayed his father later on, after his father really started to lose to Cassander. And eventually Alexander is murdered in Sicyon in 314. Rather than his troops reverting to his father, or just reverting to some random general of Cassander, the troops said that they were willing to follow Craterus. And Cassander said, sure, okay, why not? So, now you have Craterus ruling Sicyon and Corinth, two of the most strategic cities in the Peloponnese, if you're trying to control Greece from Macedon. This is very unusual. We have almost no other incidents of a woman ruling cities, basically as an independent general. And she's also not a royal woman. She had no claim to the throne at all, and it's really unclear how she got to this station unless it was through some very impressive charisma and being able to really play the diplomatic game. So apparently Cassander and others were very impressed by her. In 313, she did a very good job of holding on to the Peloponnese for Cassander. This is when Antigonus sent his nephew Telesphorus, something like that, to the Peloponnese, and he overran a lot of Cassander's holdings, but Craterus held out. And she held her two cities firm, so after his failure, Telesphorus then decided to defect, and that threw the entire Peloponnese into chaos. So a lot of that messy situation in the early Hellenistic period in Greece, where you have Macedonian generals controlling random chunks of land, and then you eventually have the Aetolian and Achaean leagues rise up, a lot of that you can attribute to Craterus preventing an overrun of the Peloponnese by the Antigonids. Later on in 309, she saw what happened to her neighbor Ptolemaeus, who was another nephew of Antigonus who had gone to Greece to deal with his traitor cousin and then revolted. And she knew that Ptolemy was not playing around, that he would kill anyone who got in his way. So she surrendered her cities to Ptolemy, but she did so in a completely underhanded way. She knew her troops did not want to serve under Ptolemy, so what she told her garrison at Corinth was, hey guys, I've got reinforcements coming in from Sicyon, make sure you open the gates to them so they can get in. So her troops unexpectedly let some Ptolemaic soldiers in and got butchered. And then Ptolemy apparently gave her the city of Petrae as a reward, or at least some big estate near it. So now she's retired and has nothing to do, but at least she cashed in and did well for herself. And then 2 years later, in 307, she started a correspondence with Demetrius the Besieger. And Demetrius basically said, I've heard you're pretty hot. You want to get together? And she said, I've heard you're pretty hot. We should do that. So they arranged for a very convoluted booty call in a tent outside of Craterus' city. But most likely this was not a legit booty call, but rather a honeypot trap trying to catch Demetrius with his pants down, literally. And it basically succeeded, except Demetrius was apparently very quick on his feet. So he had already stripped down, waiting for Craterus, and then a bunch of armed guys came in and tried to murder him, so he had to run out nude and escaped. So yes, Craterus and Demetrius are the stars of the world's first recorded booty call, at least so far as I'm aware. I got to give Craterus an A. I'm actually very impressed with what she achieved, given the circumstances. It's pretty hard to explain based on the normal mores of the ancient world. So it points to some pretty extraordinary personal ability on her part that she was able to do what she did. Okay. Next up, we have Meleager, not to be confused with Craterus' father. So now we're moving to the guys who were the big players at Babylon in 323 when Alexander died. Let me get a little bit of coffee here. Okay. So Meleager had a somewhat pedestrian career under Alexander. At the beginning of Alexander's campaigns, even before he crossed over into Asia, we know that Meleager was a taxiarch in the phalanx. So he's commanding basically a regiment of pikemen. And he was doing this as early as the Danube campaign of 335. Fast forward to 323, he's still doing the same thing. He has not been promoted. He has gotten no other experience, so he's not been with the cavalry. He hasn't had any independent commands. He's not governed anything. He's just been an infantry officer. We know that that he's one of the generals who jeered Alexander for any kind of innovations when it came to adopting Eastern customs. So he's one of these guys who was very culturally conservative and one of the more, I guess you could say, narrowly Macedonian-minded guys in the army. And Alexander, in theory, was against such people, although, as we'll see, there are plenty of guys who held that attitude who were still rewarded by Alexander. So most likely he just didn't think that Meleager was all that talented and also thought he might be a bit of a dick. So anyway, Alexander is now dead, and Perdiccas holds a commander's conference, and they try to decide what to do. Roxana's pregnant, she'll have a child in a couple of weeks, but they don't know the gender yet. Meleager and Attalus decide that the best possible king is Philip III. He is a full son of Philip II, and he's 100% Macedonian. He was actually at this time Aridaeus, but took the title Philip III. And the generals disagreed because Philip III can't rule. He's developmentally disabled. But Meleager realized that if he was the champion of Philip III, that he would basically control the king because the guy can't do anything on his own. So he came out as the most vocal advocate. After the other generals shut this down, Meleager went to the infantry, and because he had served with them very consistently and he shared a lot of their cultural values, they listened to him, and they also liked the idea of keeping an Argead, a full Argead, on the throne. So he got the assembly of soldiers riled up, and the army had basically a mini Civil War standoff kind of thing going on. Some people would call it a mutiny. I would say it's closer to a full-blown civil war. Perdiccas and the cavalry basically left Babylon and then set up a blockade, whereas Meleager, Attalus, and the infantry remained in the city. Perdiccas eventually created a bit of a hunger problem. They reconciled, and then Perdiccas played divide and conquer. He married his sister off to Attalus, who was Meleager's BFF in this whole affair, and this left Meleager isolated. Then they held a grand army assembly, and Perdiccas, who was serving as regent, selected 300 men who were chief mutineers and had them trampled to death by elephants in front of the army. Meleager knew the jig was up, despite Perdiccas ostensibly saying, "Hey, we're friends again," and so he tried to flee to a temple, but he was seized and then quietly executed. One thing he did accomplish, though, is without Meleager, there would be no King Philip III. So, whatever else you might say about Meleager, he did pull that off. And because he managed to take a nothing position and do something which had a long-term historical impact, even if it didn't really benefit him, I'm actually going to go C tier for Meleager. Because I'm judging these not just on pure achievement, but also on what was plausible for this person to pull off given their social position. And clearly Meleager was not a bodyguard, he was not a senior general, he wasn't Craterus, he was just fucking Meleager. So the fact that he made a king is pretty decent. Let me check to make sure everything's still running, so everything going good. Alright. I have read James Romm's Ghost on the Throne. That was one of the things that I really studied quite a bit for this. Alright. Let's go back. Looks like the sound and everything is still running. That's good. Okay. Next up, we have the Regent Perdiccas. After the death of Hephaestion, he was effectively Alexander's top lieutenant. Even before that, he was basically the chief administrator of the empire, at least among the actual generals. And then once Hephaestion died, he took an even more important role. He had quite a bit of experience as an independent commander, and in many ways he reproduced all of the skills Alexander had, even if he didn't possess them to quite the same extent. So he was a very qualified guy to be a regent or a king. Perdiccas, however, while he did handle the Meleager situation and benefited politically from that by gaining the support of the officer class pretty solidly, he did make some questionable decisions. His basic strategy was to wait for Alexander IV to grow up, or at least for some opportunity to emerge for him to seize power, and in the meantime he wanted to make sure that he was burnishing his own resume while holding back the other highly capable and ambitious guys. So when he assigned commands, he made sure that none of the top dogs had a position where they could really go off on a campaign and achieve great things. There were a few people he had to appease, such as Craterus and Antipater, but for the most part, he was pretty successful at relegating people to secondary roles and then trying to set himself up to control everything that mattered. This is part of why he gives Eumenes the command in Cappadocia, because Eumenes was not Macedonian and couldn't pose a threat to him. He also relied heavily on friends. Attalus, who was now his brother-in-law, he would lean on pretty heavily, even though Attalus was pretty mediocre. He also leaned heavily on his brother Alcitus, even though he was a complete dumbass. So, he was surrounding himself with people who were not necessarily top tier in order to make himself look better and hold back the careers of other people. There's some legitimacy to that strategy. It's a way to advance yourself. That being said, it was rather obvious to everyone what he was doing. So people who were in good positions, such as Ptolemy and Antigonus I and Antipater and Craterus, were afraid that one day Perdiccas would remove them from their position after he gained more prestige. So because Perdiccas was so obvious in what he's trying to do, he basically created the first successor war against himself. And he also was not super successful at keeping the loyalty of his men. One person he had near him as deputy was Seleucus. And he also had in his camp Attalus and Aridaeus, who he had tasked with building the royal procession for Alexander's body. And none of them were really all that wed to Perdiccas personally. Also, as I mentioned earlier, he had the chance to marry Cleopatra early and just make a bid all at once with that boon, but he didn't do it.
so he could be a bit indecisive at times. When he was campaigning in Egypt, Ptolemy was able to stop him along the Nile, so he had a couple of failed crossings, which were costly. And in a lot of these successor battles, the men were not really willing to go the extra mile and fight to the death against their countrymen. So they would basically just defect after it looked like the battle was turning, and then you just have men walk over en masse to another general. Perdiccas was the first person to experience this, and his men murdered him in his camp. Actually, the defection occurred after he got murdered. But yeah, the commanders in his tent, Aridaeus, Seleucus, and somebody else just murdered him, and then joined up with Ptolemy, and then the allies made a new settlement headed by Antipater. Perdiccas is a little hard to rate. Clearly, he was a very capable man. But he was in a position where he was the pioneer of being the leader on the board of this great game for Alexander's empire. And I don't think he understood that this was a game which had the main characteristic of being a screw-to-leader game. Whoever was winning was going to draw the attention of all the other players in the game. That being said, I think I'm going to be generous to Perdiccas and give him a B. No, I can't. I can't give him a B. I'm going to go with a C. He had the best position starting out, and while it was an unprecedented position, he did make some pretty obvious mistakes, mostly trusting the wrong people and not seizing opportunities when he should have. That being said, every decision that he made was going to have some outsized consequences. One thing that he did do that was pretty smart, though, was to really screw over Python. We'll come back to that later when we talk about Python, who's represented here by Culprit Commander. So yes, Perdiccas did all right, but nothing too impressive. Next up is the most impressive man in Perdiccas' camp, Eumenes of Cardia. Eumenes is one of the most popular successors because he had a life by Plutarch. He also was a very capable general who emerged from basically obscurity to become a major player. He was a good friend of Alexander, and he had even entered service under Philip II as a secretary. He was one of Alexander's closest personal friends, and he even was married into the family at Susa in 324, because Alexander thought so highly of him. That being said, Eumenes did not command the same respect from most of the other successors, at least on that level. It appears that most of them respected him on a certain level. Antigonus I and Eumenes were friends, and he also had a good relationship with Craterus, not to mention Perdiccas. But ultimately, when push came to shove, Macedonians were not really willing to share power with non-Macedonians if they didn't have to. And they always thought that a Macedonian should be in supreme command. And by the way, before anybody says anything, this has no bearing on the modern Macedonian versus Greek debate. What this has to deal with is the idea that while they were all Greek, the Macedonians were part of the kingdom more so than non-Macedonians. So it's sort of like the difference between Athenians and Spartans, if you will. The Athenians and Spartans might be willing to hang out and be best bros in a mercenary army, but if you go back to Athens and the Spartans are helping you do something, then the Athenians are going to demand the pride of place. So it's kind of like that. I wouldn't even go so far as to call it xenophobia, because I think what it really is just self-serving rhetoric, more so than anything else. Anyhow, Eumenes was a guy, I'm not going to go through all the details of his career because he's got that life of Plutarch, and these details are fairly well known to a lot of people. But he was a master of ruses, and he also had the ability to react to difficult circumstances and come up with strategies to deal with problems that most people would have not been able to overcome. He was besieged at one point by Antigonus I after the collapse of the Perdican coalition, and to keep his horses in shape, he set up indoor exercise areas where he had the horses suspended so they'd have to move their legs, and that kept them in shape so if he needed to sally out. Later on, after he escaped to the east, he devised a way to assert his authority over Cestus, who was a former bodyguard of Alexander. And he basically used superstition, and the imagery of Alexander's cloak. And while a lot of people did see through this as a ruse, it was effective. Earlier, when he had fought Craterus, he realized that the men might defect because Craterus was the most popular general in the army. So he realized he had to win quickly and could not rely on his Macedonians. He had raised a bunch of local cavalry, so he tried to overwhelm the flanks, and that's exactly what happened. And then in the ensuing melee, Craterus was toppled from his horse and killed. So Eumenes was very clever. He was a great general. He also gave Antigonus the first fits, something that no one else other than Seleucus was able to do. So, in terms of pure ability, Eumenes was clearly the man. That being said, he was never able to overcome the fact that he was not Macedonian. And ultimately, his downfall came not because of anything he did wrong, but because of Peucestus betraying him at the Battle of Gabiene. It's possible Peucestus just fucked up and failed to do his part, but it's likely that this was an outright act of treachery. So, with Eumenes, he's got to be pretty high up there. Because he didn't create a kingdom, and because his cause ultimately failed, I can't go with S tier, but I will go with A tier. Next up is someone that Eumenes had to work with at some point, Perdiccas' younger brother, Alcitus. He is represented here by Jerome Bonaparte, another sibling who was not all that useful. Basically, he was a pretty obscure general in his own right. He had some minor unit commands in India, so he rose later through the ranks. And this is mostly because his brother was a big player with Alexander and could put in a good word. He was with his brother in Sardis in 322. And it was there that Perdiccas decided that Alcitus should be the one to go arrest Cunani and Adia. So it's hard to really assess how this scuffle broke out and went down, but Alcitus's first known assignment was a complete disaster. Cunani was killed, and some of his men also died. And this basically forced Perdiccas to allow Adia to marry Philip III, become Eurydice II, and then go on to create problems for the next 6 or so years. He was left in the north by his brother, and then put under the overall command of Eumenes. Alcitus thought that he was a big deal because his brother was the regent and he was a Macedonian. So he chafed under the command of Eumenes the whole way through. He also advised surrendering to Craterus. So this is part of why Eumenes realized that he had to strike hard and fast and win decisively, because he knew that if the battle dragged on, that Alcitus would just surrender and defect with his men. So that makes Eumenes' victory all the more impressive, I think. Anyhow, after he had seen Craterus fall in battle, he was upset and decided to leave. Especially when he learned his brother was dead, too. He's like, I'm not serving under Eumenes. That would suck. So he tried to side with Attalus, the guy who had been Meleager's friend and who controlled a treasury. And Attalus passed on his friendship. He's like, that's all right. I appreciate the offer of friendship, but I'm sure I can find a better ally. And then Attalus had a setback, so he joined up with Alcitus, and even let Alcitus be the supreme commander. So they're holding up on the coast of Pisidia. And now Alcitus has a ground force that he had with him, and he has money and ships from Attalus. And although the terrain around them is pretty hilly, and it would be possible for somebody to sneak up and then come over the hill, they don't set pickets for some reason. They decide, we're safe. Antigonus is quite a ways away, and he's an older guy with one eye, so what could he really do? And not surprisingly, Antigonus marched on their camp, took them by surprise, and Alcitus was KIA. Easy F. What more can I say? I think he's the definition of an F-tier successor. All right. Next up, we have... Let's see... consult my official list of the ordering to make sure I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing. Okay. Next up should be Leonitus. Next up is Attalus. I used a coin because he had a big treasury at one point. Okay, so I didn't screw this up. Good. Okay, so Attalus was a veteran of Alexander's campaigns. He had some infantry and some naval experience prior to the outbreak of the Wars of the Successors. As I mentioned earlier, he was Meleager's chief ally at Babylon, but then he defected to Perdiccas, became his brother-in-law, and became one of his generals. He had chafed under the command of Eumenes to some extent. He had kind of gone his own way. Then Perdiccas had been murdered, and he went completely rogue. I think he was trying to distance himself from the Perdiccans because they had all been declared outlaws. So what he was trying to do is go his own path and make a separate peace. He is the guy who was spreading around coins at Triparadisus, trying to help Queen Eurydice II in her mutiny. And then he tried to invade Rhodes and set up his own little state there. The reason why he went to Rhodes is because he learned that Ptolemy was planning to invade Palestine in force, and he knew he couldn't hold out against a large army. So he took all of his men and ships, sailed to Rhodes, assumed that it would be an easy conquest, and like a lot of people who underestimated Rhodes in the Hellenistic period, he was defeated pretty heavily. And that is when he decided, you know what, maybe Alcitus isn't completely useless. So he went to Alcitus, yielded his command, and apparently did not object when Alcitus failed to post sentries. He was taken prisoner in Pisidia by Antigonus I, and most likely he died in captivity years later. It doesn't appear that Antigonus had him executed, so his career ended pretty ingloriously. I don't see any great evidence of ability with Attalus, but he does seem to have had some ambition, but also a little bit of cleverness, even if it wasn't backed by a lot of military skill. I'm going to give Attalus an E. I think he's clearly a cut above Alcitus. And, but I don't think he's that much better than Alcitus. He was just a little bit more independent-minded, and apparently more charming since Perdiccas was willing to take him in, even though he had created a mutiny and almost caused a civil war among the Macedonians. Next up, represented by an image of Alexander himself, is Leonitus. Early in the campaigns of Alexander, he met with the royal family, Darius's wife and daughters, and one of them approached Leonitus thinking it was Alexander because he was the tallest and most handsome officer. And Alexander thought it was funny, and everybody got a good laugh out of it. But I think that this went to Leonitus's head because he always thought of himself, I think, as a taller, better-looking version of his king. That being said, Leonitus was also arguably the best of the bodyguards in terms of being an actual bodyguard. At the Siege of Multan in 326, he was the first guy to get to Alexander's side after Alexander recklessly jumped over the walls after his ladder broke, and he was isolated fighting against the local Indians. Leonitus and then the soldier Pusestus were able to save their king. Pusestus, of course, earned a spot in the bodyguards, but it was really the combination of Leonitus and Pusestus which kept Alexander alive. Alexander was badly wounded that time, had a pierced lung, and some people who have talked about the cause of his death in 323 have tried to say that that wound at Multan had a big role to play in his early death in 323. At any rate, Leonitus, of course, was full of ambition, and he was seen as one of the most noble of the Macedonians. He was highly respected by his peers, and also he was one of the guys who had married somebody who was very important already. He was sent west to a small part of Asia Minor, which doesn't sound like a great command. Clearly Perdiccas was trying to sideline him. Then the Lamian War broke out, and Antipater quickly found himself in trouble. So now Leonitus can potentially ride to the rescue. He enters Europe. He goes on a tour of Pella, where he's greeted as a hero. People are reminded of Alexander, especially because Leonitus is imitating all of his mannerisms. And he arranges with Cleopatra that as soon as the war's over, they're going to get married. So things are looking up for Leonitus, and had things played out just a little differently, this guy might be one of the major successors. Everything was in his favor. He was well set up. But in the Lamian War, as he's trying to rescue Antipater, he is killed in action. and that puts an end to his career prematurely. In my alternative successor scenario, Leonitus' career goes a little longer. I won't spoil in what ways he develops, but it's much different than the historical Leonitus, let's put it that way. Rating him on his role as a successor, I feel like he had the right strategy. He was acting boldly, moving quickly, and he really just got unlucky. Also, he happened to be facing the Athenian general Leosthenes, who was the last great Athenian commander, and that was kind of an unforeseen circumstance. So I can't be too harsh. I was originally thinking a D, but I think I'm actually going to go with a C for Leonitus. Being killed in action is not... I won't really hold that against somebody because that can happen in a war. And because it usually doesn't happen in most battles for most of these generals, I think that it kind of is a freak occurrence. Most of these guys were very skilled in individual combat, highly experienced. So getting killed in action was pretty much a matter of bad luck more than, say, a lack of skill or what have you. Okay. Next up is Craterus. No. Wait, yes, it's Craterus, sorry. Craterus is, as I mentioned earlier, the most popular of the generals going into 323. And he, without a doubt, was one of the strongest contenders for the empire after Alexander's death. In the last few years of Alexander's Asian campaign after the death of Eumenes, Craterus had become the sort of key subordinate. During the retreat from India, he led the overland element that didn't go through the Gadrasian desert. It was actually the main force. So Alexander clearly entrusted a lot of authority in Craterus. Craterus was also maybe 10 or so years older than Alexander, so he commanded a lot of respect, but unlike, say, Antipater, he wasn't elderly, so he was in a pretty good position. Comparable to Antigonus, but much more prominent. So, Craterus also had a large body of men under him when Alexander died, who was leading veterans back to Europe, and then he was going to take over as regent from Antipater. So he was in a great position. And then, after Leonitus dies, he got the chance to be the great savior of Antipater, and that's exactly what he did. He commissioned a fleet in Cilicia, or he already had a fleet. It was under Lytos the White. He sent it, and it was that fleet which defeated the Athenians at sea. And then he came to Antipater's rescue overland and oversaw the land victory as well. So he became a hero for that. He married Antipater's daughter, Phila, so now he had the most senior man in the empire in his corner. And things were looking all Craterus for a long time. And then he led the combined forces of Antipater, Antigonus, and Craterus against Eumenes, and that should have been an easy victory. The one mistake Craterus made is that he probably underestimated Eumenes. Now, he did know Eumenes was a smart guy, and they apparently were friends. When he was mortally wounded, Eumenes met him, and they wept together and talked about the old times, apparently. But he apparently didn't think that Eumenes would be able to put up a fight, and he thought that his men would just defect. Because I think he showed them his bare head. He's like, look, I'm Craterus. Don't you recognize me? Come on over, guys. We're not fighting this out. So anyway, he was kind of taken off guard and defeated. And he's another guy who kind of died due to a fluke, just like Leonitus. He was in a great position. In fact, I would say if you talk about somebody's position going into the Wars of Successors, I think he actually has the best position of anybody, even more so than Perdiccas, because Perdiccas starts out in the hot seat, whereas Craterus has a lot of prestige. He then creates a corner position with Antipater. He has a bunch of veterans under his command, and he has tons of independent command experience, at least comparatively when looking at the others. So this guy really should have been a major player, but his horse's hooves thought otherwise. So I'm going to go with C for Craterus. Although he spelled his name with a K historically. But in the anglicized or Latinized version, it's with a C. So there you go. Next up is General Aridaeus, not to be confused with Philip III. General Aridaeus was a fairly minor figure who was an ally of Perdiccas. He seems to have been involved in a lot of engineering projects and was probably kind of a protege of Hephaestion before his death in 324. In 323, when Alexander died, Perdiccas turned to this experienced builder and charged him with building Alexander's funeral vehicle. This task took 2 years, and then he had to lead this procession to the coast to get on a ship and then go to the city of Agai in Macedonia to bury Alexander near his relatives. So it's a very sacred task, but it ultimately removes Aridaeus from the mix in many ways. Famously, of course, as he's marching to the coast, Ptolemy springs out of Egypt with an army, seizes the body, and brings it back to Thebes. Later on, of course, he relocates the body to Alexandria, builds a tomb and all that, but for now, it's at, I believe, Thebes or maybe Memphis. Anyway, so this is a major failure on Aridaeus' part. Probably not his fault. I don't think he anticipated this happening. Robbing the body of the dead king was fairly sacrilegious, and under different circumstances, Ptolemy probably would have been a pariah for doing it, but because it was an act against Perdiccas, and a lot of the major generals of the empire were anti-Perdican, it ended up working out in Ptolemy's favor. Aridaeus was loyal to Perdiccas at this point, but he wasn't really rewarded with the major command. He did go with Perdiccas to Egypt, and he was one of the guys who murdered him in his tent. Perhaps he felt a little betrayed that maybe Perdiccas was kind of soft blaming him for what had happened. At any rate, Ptolemy seems to have become a big Aridaeus fan for some reason, and he helped Aridaeus and Python become the new guardians of the king and queen. The problem is that a lot of people suspect that Ptolemy knew that Aridaeus and Python were incapable of doing the job, and that he was trying to discredit them and strengthen his own hand going into the Triparadisus. I don't know whether that's true or not, but certainly, once again, Aridaeus failed to deliver, and by the time the conference happened, Adia was working with Attalus and trying to create a mutiny. Antipater nearly got murdered. It was pretty bad. Let's see. Now he goes to Cyprus. Oh, wait. No, okay. So in the settlement at Triparadisus, he was given command of Hellas, Pontine, Phrygia. In theory, this gives him a chance to gain legitimacy by conquering barbarians who were not part of the empire yet. But instead, he decided to do some other stuff. He goes to the city of Cyzicus, which is the Greek city, can't take it. And then he decides to ally himself with Eumenes against Antigonus. So he marches on the city of Nora, where Eumenes is under siege. He can't relieve the siege. Later on, he is besieged in turn by Antigonus, and then he is saved by Lytos the White. We'll come back to that in a minute. But after Lytos rescues him, they let their guard down, and then just as he had to Alcitus, Antigonus took advantage of their lack of preparations, launched a surprise attack, and this resulted in Aridaeus' death on the beaches near the city that he was at. If you look at his military record in battle, counting the stolen body, Aridaeus has a very impressive 0-3 record, which is good for the F tier. Okay, next up we have one of the most interesting figures of the successor period, and I wouldn't say he's necessarily my favorite successor, but he's way up there. Lytos the White. Not many Macedonians were fond of sea command, but Lytos the White fancied himself an admiral. He's the guy Craterus put in charge of the fleet in Cilicia, and he defeated the Athenians twice in the Lamian War, and really helped to bring that war to a close. After winning these two great naval battles, he began to fancy himself the living manifestation of Poseidon. I'm not kidding. He would pose on the prows of his ships holding a trident. And apparently, just like Poseidon, he was pretty fond of partying. That being said, he clearly did have a talent for naval command in a period where there aren't really too many good admirals. So this is his claim to fame. It's something that no one else really has. And he seems to have played the political game relatively well for a while. So after winning the battles of Abydos and Amorgus, he then goes on to side with Antipater and Craterus against Perdiccas, helps them to transfer their forces to Asia. Had he sided with Perdiccas, then it's possible that he could have kept them contained in Europe. So he was a power player, and people recognized how important he was, at least for this little bit of time. And, let's see. Yeah, he, what was it he did? He was rewarded after Triparadisus with the satrapy of Lydia, which is one of the wealthiest places in Asia Minor, also one of the most developed and settled. So that's a pretty rich prize. And he has this for 2 years. But then when Antigonus is named general of Asia, he's not interested in following Antigonus, and they get into a conflict. He takes his fleet and manages to save his ally Attalus, but after the victory, he is really jubilant, and they all get wasted on the beach, have a great party. And the next morning, when Antigonus attacks both overland and by sea, a very hungover Lytos the White is unable to resist their attack. He flees with one ship, all the rest were captured. He made it to Thrace and tried to take refuge with Lysimachus, but Lysimachus had him executed to win favor with Antigonus. Lytos is a fascinating guy. He sort of sets the precedent for really being into the idea of the manifestation of the god on earth thing that the Hellenistic monarchs got into. Clearly sounds like a fun guy. I got to go with the B tier. I mean, clearly he screwed up in that last battle. He had become hubristic and careless. But it seems like a lot of people underestimated Antigonus. This was a fairly common thing to do. So, I suppose in a way it's understandable, even if it is really stupid. Okay. Next up, we have... Oh, man. I forgot to put an entry for Nearchus of Crete. But Nearchus actually wasn't really much of a successor because he just spoke up at the conference at Babylon, got shouted down. He wanted to make Alexander's bastard son Heracles the new king, but Heracles was half Persian. And even though he had been good friends with everybody, just like Eumenes and Aristodemus and some of these other Greek guys, at the assembly, the Macedonians were basically of the opinion that because he was not Macedonian, he should shut the fuck up. So he got shouted down. The Arabian campaign got canceled. He was supposed to lead a large contingent there. So effectively, he just retired to Antigonus's court, wrote some memoirs about his voyages in India and along the Gedrosian coast, or really the Persian Gulf coast. So he had an interesting career, but he wasn't really a successor. He also provided some advice to Demetrius in 313 or 312. Demetrius was very young at the time and needed a lot of help. So yeah, I'm not too sad about the fact that we forgot Nearchus. If I had to rate him, I'd probably go with a D. I mean, he wasn't really going to have much of an impact. I guess in theory he could have gotten the job that Lytos the White had, but for whatever reason he did not put himself in that position. Maybe he just kind of gave up. I don't know. Anyway, on to Antipater. One interesting thing about Antipater that most people don't realize is that he was actually an intellectual. He was a close friend of Aristotle, and he also exchanged correspondence with Isocrates in Athens. The two of them were pen pals, and apparently Antipater was very well read and always kept up on the latest in philosophy. However, by 323, Antipater was way past his prime. He was already in his 70s. It appears that he was moving with discomfort. His generalship had declined considerably since even 330 when he had defeated the Spartans. He was not the man whom Alexander had left in charge back in 334. So we're judging him on his role in the successor period. So if I judge him at less than what you might think appropriate, just keep that in mind. This is not a career achievement award, but rather just successor period. If we're talking about success, his whole career, then clearly Antipater is one of the greatest Macedonians ever. But we're talking about the last 4 years of his life when he was pretty much spent. So, he struggled mightily in the Lemian War, which got its name because he lost a battle to Leonitus and was besieged in the Thessalian city of Lemia. Thessaly revolted, and then Athens was able to build up that coalition even more. Leonitus arrived to bail him out, but Leonitus died in battle. Fortunately for Macedon, so did Leosthenes. It was basically a stalemate where the Athenians had the edge but didn't know what to do. And then Craterus arrived and bailed out Antipater by both land and sea. And Antipater had a fleet already, but he didn't have an admiral, so that's where Lytos the White came in. So, had Craterus been further away, it's possible that Antipater would have been defeated, and that Macedon would have been kicked out of all of Greece and Thessaly, and then Craterus would have been tasked with reconquering all of that, and basically eliminated from the race for a long time, although it would have given him a chance to win a lot of legitimacy by really upholding the legacy of Philip and Alexander. At any rate, though, Antipater did survive, and he was still a highly respected guy. A lot of people were willing to trust him because he was so prestigious, and also because the guy was old and wouldn't live that much longer. And his sons were all fairly young and unaccomplished when compared with most of the major successors. So you could kind of trust Antipater to be fair as insofar as you could trust any of the successors. So he traveled to Asia to try Paradisus, almost got murdered, but he was rescued, and then he rewarded all of his friends, including Antigonus. I imagine that when he set up Antigonus as general of Asia, he thought that he was doing right by the empire. He tended to prefer guys who were a little more older and professional. Perhaps it was in an attempt to reward guys he knew better, help his friends out. I don't know. Maybe he was a servant of the empire to the end, or maybe he just simply didn't see a path to victory for his family. At any rate, Antipater was the guy who really put Antigonus in the driver's seat and gave him overall command of Asia against the remaining Perdiccans under Eumenes. And this ultimately was what really set Antigonus up to create an empire. He also gave his title of General of Europe to Polyperchon rather than his son Cassander. Apparently, Antipater was loyal to the Argiads, at least on some level. However, his son did not accept this, and this created a civil war. We've already talked about Olympias' role in it and Adia's role in it. So Antipater still had a lot of clout, but he was not as effective as he'd once been. Had he been 10 years younger, I think that the whole successor period would have played out very differently. But as it was, he was not in a position to make a bid for anything. And when he did try to make bids, he was mostly trying to work with someone like Craterus, a younger guy who could go get the job done while he just lent his prestige. I'm going to have to give Antipater a C. And again, I don't like doing it because I respect Antipater, but he was very old by this point. Next up is Antipater's chosen successor, the often forgotten Polyperchon. Polyperchon was a long-serving veteran of middling rank in Alexander's armies, and despite the fact that he does not seem to have been a very good general, apparently he was a consummate soldier. Later on, Pyrrhus of Epirus will famously say that the best soldier to ever live was Polyperchon. And indeed, Polyperchon had a great deal of perseverance. This is a guy who never gave up despite massive setbacks and stunning betrayals. So, he was Antipater's chief deputy after Craterus was killed. He had been Craterus' chief deputy bringing the men home, so then he basically was inherited by Antipater, and he was also left behind in Europe when Antipater traveled to try Paradisus. So he and Antipater seemed to have gotten along really well, and as an older, more experienced guy, Polyperchon seemed like a safer bet than Cassander. However, Polyperchon was not all that politically savvy. He did not anticipate the revolt by Cassander, and he lost a lot of land early. Then he was forced to basically cede a lot of his authority to Olympias to hang on to power. For his part, Cassander sought out Adia. While they had defeated Adia, Cassander gathered his forces from the south, marched north, and Olympias' crimes undermined the legitimacy of Polyperchon. Polyperchon also could not come up with a good strategy, and while he was a good soldier, he was not a very good general. I can't think of any battles Polyperchon won, and certainly he was not on Cassander's level as a commander. So he was defeated. Later on, he and his son Alexander will be trying to conquer stuff in the Peloponnese, and he effectively sells his title of General of Europe in exchange for some concessions and money. I think that might be why Alexander defected. Anyway, Alexander then defected to Cassander. And that must have been a stunning betrayal, because he betrayed his father and started seizing stuff. Alexander is then murdered in 314, father and son never reconciled. And then, rather than possibly reverting to Polyperchon, because the men had some sort of personal loyalty to the family, it went to his widow Cratesipolis, who also did nothing to help her father-in-law. And it seems that Cratesipolis was way stronger in terms of her position than Polyperchon, who was like on some periphery in the Peloponnese somewhere. So he basically lived out his last years in obscurity as a marginal player. And he also at one point submitted himself to Cassander. So Polyperchon's career is a sad one. He was betrayed, but he never gave up. And he managed to cling on to a little piece of the Peloponnese for a very long time. That being said, holy shit, he fell a long way. Yeah, he was the new Antipater, and then he ended up as one of the most minor successors possible. I've also heard some people say that he is the sort of unsung hero of the Second War of the Successors. I think there's an article about that somebody wrote, so look that up if you're interested. I gotta go with an E for Polyperchon, simply because he did very little with what he had, and he had the misfortune of facing Cassander, who was an extremely capable guy. Speaking of Cassander, here he is. Cassander is infamous because he killed Alexander IV and Roxanne. Also, the sources were not kind to him because the Antipatrid dynasty died a few years after Cassander because his sons and successors were very sickly and got involved in the civil war, and then involved Pyrrhus and Demetrius. So the sources had no reason to suck up to Cassander, and they painted him as a villain because he had ended the Argead dynasty. That being said, I think anybody else in Cassander's position would have done the same thing. Had the Argeads been under the control of Antigonus I, they would have probably also died, although Antigonus might have made it look like an accident. I really don't think that this would have gone differently under anybody else, but as it is, Cassander did inherit a bit of a stigma for all of this. Actually, however, Cassander was a great king, and he was a very worthy successor to Philip II, and almost as good of a state builder in many ways. He got Macedon back on track and really set up the Antigonid Macedon of the Hellenistic period, which had to revitalize its power after a whole bunch of people moved abroad. He built 2 new cities, one of which was Cassandria, which was to be his new capital, but kinda didn't work out too well. But another city he founded, Thessalonica, became the chief city of the north. Despite not being an Asian campaign veteran, and not really being trusted with all that much by his father, Cassander was a very skilled military commander. And unlike a lot of guys who were very physically vigorous and could fight from the front lines, it appears that Cassander was always sickly, so he had to use his mind to win battles. He couldn't ride out heroically the same way that, say, Alexander or Leonitus could. So he defeated Polyperchon in the Civil War based on the fact that he's the son of Antipater. He then defeated Olympias, who had all the prestige in the world because he let her piss away that prestige. He sided with Adia, but then let her and her husband get murdered by Olympias, so that way they couldn't possibly exercise influence against him. And then he took over Macedon from about 316 forward, eliminated Alexander IV, And while king of Macedon, he had to fend off threats from Demetrius, who was a lot stronger. Lysimachus was beginning to get his house in order in Thrace, so he was a potential threat. Cassander kept him in check. He prevented Antigonus from crossing over and invading directly. He kept a foothold in Greece despite multiple rogue dynasts and the Ptolemaic fleet. And a lot of his subordinates sucked. He had two brothers, Nicanor and Pleistarchus, and both of them were pretty mediocre. And he also had a general, Prepolaus, we'll talk about in a minute. And none of them were very good. Basically, if Cassander sent out a subordinate, the idea was that they would hold and possibly lose until Cassander arrived to win. He was his only skilled general. So, I have to go with S tier. Cassander achieved great things. And he didn't necessarily have the best position in the world. He also wasn't in the best health. I mean, he had to fight his own body to do what he did. So I can respect that. That's pretty impressive. Next up is Alexander, son of Polyperchon. He actually served... Sorry. Not him. Prepolaus. The best way I can explain this is that if Cassander is Vegeta, Prepolaus is Nappa. He's a loyal but somewhat inept underling. Prepolaus, to the best of my knowledge, never won a single battle. However, in the Hellenistic period, especially the early Hellenistic, where generals defected left and right and switched sides and sons betrayed fathers and everything else, Prepolaus was loyal as hell. And he always served Cassander's interest, even if he couldn't do so competently. And because he he tried at least, I guess that's something that you can't say for a lot of people. So if you think of Cassander as a latter-day Philip II, then maybe Prepolaus is his Parmenion just without the skill. Or if Cassander is a latter-day Augustus, a former-day Augustus, what am I talking about? Then maybe Prepolaus is kind of like Agrippa, just without the talent. D tier. And the D is simply for loyalty. If it was based on talent, he'd be E or an F, but because loyalty was so hard to come by, that's worth a D by itself, a minimal passing grade, just for not betraying anybody. Alright, next up we have Alexander, son of Polyperchon, and I decided to use the book cover from Alexander the Great Failure by John D. Granger, a revisionist history if there ever was one. Alexander actually served his father well in the Peloponnese early on, as his father was trying to hold on against Cassander. Later on, his father sent him to Tyre to negotiate with Antigonus, and it was Alexander who helped to sell the title of General of Europe in exchange for resources. However, he was the one winning all the battles, and his father would fail to defend what he won, and he must have gotten fed up with his father for being a bit incompetent, so he unexpectedly defected to Cassander. Pretty dick move, but Polyperchon wasn't exactly getting anything done, to be fair. Once he was independent, he had limited success, however. He actually worked way better as a subordinate than as an independent commander, and this is partly because by the time that he decided to revolt and go rogue, Antigonus had sent his general Aristodemus of Miletus into the fray, and Aristodemus was able to contain all of Alexander's moves. The motives for his betrayal are unknown, but wouldn't we like to know? Also, when he was murdered in Sicyon in 314 by a nobleman, his widow was able to take command, which again, as I mentioned earlier, is bizarre. Whatever else you might say about Alexander, son of Polyperchon, his betrayals, his failures, he had a hot wife, and you can't take that away from him. I will go with a D tier for Alexander, son of Polyperchon. Next up is the most noble of the successors, the only guy who I think was truly and unambiguously noble in his intentions, and really didn't have any ulterior motive that I can detect. This is Aristobulus, the oldest of the bodyguards. So when Alexander died, Aristobulus was one of the 8 bodyguards. Originally, this had been 7, but we'll get to Cestus in a minute. He won a slot. Aristobulus was very well positioned to be a major player as a bodyguard. All the other bodyguards, think of Ptolemy, Python, etc., were able to get some pretty good stuff out of the dispensation. But Aristobulus was a Perdican loyalist. He actually advocated from an early date they shouldn't do this regency thing. When Alexander handed Perdiccas the ring, he was saying Perdiccas should be king. So he probably embarrassed Perdiccas a little bit in front of the others, saying, look, Perdiccas, just take the throne. And everybody was like, fuck no. We'll delay this so I can eventually overthrow Perdiccas. But Aristobulus wanted to just put Perdiccas on the throne and be done with it. So, very interesting position. I can't think of anyone else who had a good position to make a run at things, who just wanted to empower someone else instead. He wasn't really rewarded by Perdiccas too much. I assume that's because Perdiccas didn't need to keep him happy. And he was one of Perdiccas' generals during the First War of the Successors. He commanded a small fleet that went to Cyprus, so it was a subsidiary operation. And it's unclear exactly how well he did. He was still on Cyprus when Perdiccas was murdered. And it seems that because he was more respected by his colleagues and others, he actually negotiated with Antipater and Ptolemy and the rest, and he got a deal where he was effectively just allowed to retire home to Macedonia. At least that's what it seems like. So we're talking about a guy, not only did he want to make someone else king, but then he retired, something that no one else had ever thought of at this point. This guy should be the official mascot of the AARP, because he effectively, so far as I'm aware, invented the idea of retirement. Anyway, he was called back into action when the Civil War broke out between Cassander and Polyperchon. He was the one guy that they were hoping to get on their side. They also hoped that Eumenes might cross over and join on behalf of the Argead, since he had made such a big deal of being an Argead loyalist. But it turns out that for all of his supposed loyalty to the Argeads, Eumenes was not willing to take any risk for them. He was only willing to do so strategically and in his own interest. No blame attached, but let's keep it real. Eumenes was not a selfless servant of the Argead dynasty. However, I think there's a good case that Aristobulus was. He sided with Olympius, who was very hard to work with, and he became one of the senior generals. It appears that the strategy that they pursued was either Polyperchon's or Olympius's rather than Aristobulus's, but basically the three of them commanded different armies, and they were waiting for Cassander to invade the north. Cassander was able to defeat Aristobulus early, forcing him to retreat to Amphipolis, and then Cassander sent a subordinate after him, but this guy named Craterus was someone whom Aristobulus was able to deal with. Aristobulus defeated him and forced him to swear an oath not to take up arms again against Alexander IV. And for whatever reason, even as a lenient treatment in this era, later on this would come back to haunt Aristobulus. So after Olympius is captured, Aristobulus negotiates with Cassander, and Cassander swears that he will not do anything to harm Aristobulus. So Aristobulus agrees to surrender at Amphipolis, which is a major port and an important strategic point. And then he's suddenly put on trial by the family of Craterus. And they claim that Aristobulus mistreated him, even though there's no evidence that this is true. It was basically a kangaroo court, and Aristobulus was convicted and executed. So he really got screwed. And while he is an honorable man, and one of the few guys I would trust in this period, I got to go with E tier because pretty much everything he did was kind of a failure, and he didn't show any great ability. I guess you could say in his defense, at least he didn't try to carve out a kingdom, given his limitations, so he's got that going for him. He's the opposite of Lytos the White insofar as he did not suffer from hubris. Next up, we have the much-requested Pyrrhus of Epirus, one of the few men who was not alive when Alexander died, but who definitely envisioned himself as part of that generation. He didn't come of age until 301, and he fought at the Battle of Ipsus on the side of Antigonus and Demetrius. He was a cousin of Alexander and resembled him in some ways. A lot of veterans said that he kind of moved like Alexander. Pyrrhus was a fairly narrow-minded warrior. He had no interest outside of war, and if someone tried to talk about any other subject with him, he'd get bored and change the subject. At Ipsus, despite only being 17 years old, Pyrrhus was cutting a swath through the enemy opposed to him, and apparently he very much impressed both Antigonus and Demetrius. Of course, the Antagonists lost the battle, Antigonus was killed, and Pyrrhus returned home to Epirus. He also had to fight for his throne a lot in his early years. He didn't really have a good claim to the Macedonian throne because he was purely Epirote, despite being a relative of Alexander. He was only related to Alexander on the Epirote side, not at all on the Macedonian side. I believe he was a second cousin. So his main goal in life was to overrun Macedon and seize the throne, thereby becoming the new Alexander. The problem for Pyrrhus is that the army would not accept him for long periods of time, and also his own Epirote army was fairly small, even if it was very good. So it was very difficult for him to stay in power, even if he could seize power from time to time. And that's why he embarked on his famous Italian and Sicilian campaigns. He famously fought 3 battles against the Romans, the so-called Pyrrhic victories, where you win the battlefield, but you lose so many men that you effectively lost. He lent his name to that. He was a very good tactical commander, but he does seem to have really lacked much in the way of strategic thinking. He also seems to have had something like ADD when it came to strategy. He would abandon one pursuit midway through to try to seize an opportunity elsewhere. So I guess you could also say that he's a guy who probably never suffered from the sunk cost fallacy, because he never really sunk much effort into anything before abandoning it, so I guess there's that. And he also, even as he was getting older, going into the 270s, was not averse to risk. He would dive right into the fray and fight in the front lines. That ultimately cost him his life in Argos when a woman threw a roof tile and broke his neck. So he died fairly late in the successor period. And he never really achieved with his aim, even though he did make a big impact on history and held the throne of Macedon a couple times. I think he's really more famous in the Roman history than he is in the history of the successors, though. But it's kind of interesting that he has a big place in both. So for that alone, he's pretty important. That being said, as a successor, because he was so bad at strategy, I can't go higher than a C. It was really that lack of strategy that prevented him from achieving something lasting. Next up is Lysimachus. Lysimachus was a bodyguard of Alexander, and apparently even before 323, Lysimachus was known as a military genius by his peers. That's probably why Perdiccas dispatched him to Thrace with a small army. It was a worthy task for a military genius, since you have to hold off a larger number of men with a smaller, and also it was a good way to take a military genius out of the running, because it would be years before Lysimachus would have enough troops to mount a threat to his neighbors. So this is actually the smartest of all of Perdiccas' placements. Lysimachus was able to pacify the area and bide his time. He also was arguably the key general at Ipsos in 301, as much or more so than Seleucus. He managed to repel a number of Antigonid attempts to establish a foothold in Europe, despite being massively outnumbered. He dealt with a number of rebellions. He dealt with a number of mutinies inspired by his neighbors. And after Ipsos, he inherited a good chunk of Asia Minor and was now a major player in the game. After the Antipatrid civil wars and Demetrius's failed run as king of Macedon, Lysimachus also inherited Macedon and with it most of Greece. So it came down to a contest between a young Ptolemy II with only Egypt Seleucus in control of the east, and then Lysimachus with Asia Minor and Europe. But it seems that perhaps Lysimachus had some sort of a mental breakdown. His son Agathocles started a revolt of some kind, or maybe this was paranoia on the part of Lysimachus. His son had been very capable, and by this point was a worthy successor. But Lysimachus had a younger son who was in his teenage years, and his new wife persuaded him to side with that son against his older son. He had Agathocles put to death, and at this point, Lysimachus is in his late 70s or so, and so he really needs an older, experienced son to be his right arm. And now he doesn't have that. And now he fights Seleucus, who apparently has held up very well against the ravages of time. Seleucus comes, and Lysimachus' defense of Asia Minor is pretty static and uninspired. He doesn't march on Seleucus in his camp when he is exposed, and he basically just awaits him at Corupedium. Seleucus wins and inherits all of Lysimachus' lands. With Lysimachus, it's a little bit difficult to rate him between S and A. I don't want to be too harsh about how his career ended, because I honestly think he had either aged out or else he had suffered a legitimate mental breakdown of some kind. Maybe some severe PTSD that kicked in. I don't know what it was. I'm going to go with S tier just out of respect. That being said, his career did not end well. But because he was so old by that point, I can't really hold that against him in good consciousness. One interesting anecdote about Lysimachus is that he and Demetrius absolutely hated each other. Demetrius was a fairly happy-go-lucky guy, and Lysimachus was apparently borderline humorless. Although one time a historian of the Alexander campaigns came to his court and read aloud his work. And he was talking about all kinds of crazy stuff like Amazons and wild creatures that were of fantastic description. And Lysimachus at one point interrupted him. He said, "Oh, well, that's really cool. Where was I during all this?" So I think he actually did have a bit of a sense of humor, but it was very dry, and he was of a rather harsh temperament. Next up is one of the fan favorites, Antigonus the One-Eyed. Antigonus was a veteran of Philip II. He was significantly older than most of the other successors, basically a full generation older, but not as old as Antipater. He accompanied Alexander into Asia, but Alexander left him in Paphlagonia and basically forgot about him in 334. Antigonus was holding up some of the supply line with a small force of men, and it was thanks to his efforts that reinforcements were able to get to Alexander deeper into Asia. Antigonus fought against fairly long odds and was consistently successful. He was also a very popular governor. Long after his death, the residents of Paphlagonia would say that they were digging for Antigonus because they missed the years of prosperity under his rule. He was a very cunning strategist. He was a pretty good general, not a great general, but a good one, and clearly also a great administrator. At least one scholar, Richard Bellows, thinks that Antigonus effectively invented the Hellenistic state. During the first war of the Successors, the one against Perdiccas, Antigonus was one of the primary drivers of the alliance between Craterus and Antipater. He fled from his court to visit them and created that alliance, and then also helped to get Ptolemy in on the action. He probably wouldn't have been a big deal because he didn't enjoy the kind of prestige that they had, but then of course Craterus happened to die in a fluke accident. And now he is good friends with Antipater, and he helped to craft the alliance, so he has to be rewarded. He's got a lot of experience in Asia, this general area where Eumenes is active, so Antipater is cool with making him the new general of Asia, a new position where he's the commander-in-chief of the anti-Perdican army. So now Antigonus is suddenly in a brilliant position, and he's so well aligned with Antipater that he arranges a marriage between his son Demetrius and Phila, who is now a widow. Phila's 10 or more years older than Demetrius, but they do get married, and this marriage ultimately produces Antigonus II. So the Antipatrid line did continue through the Antigonids indirectly. That being said, Antigonus was then able to defeat most of his rivals, although Eumenes proved to be a very difficult challenge, as we've discussed. He had to pursue Eumenes deep into Asia, and ultimately only won at Gabiene due to the treachery of Perseus. Antigonus, for the most part, was known for mercy, although there were times where he inflicted some pretty harsh punishments on people. Famously, he had the general Antigonus burned to death while he was still alive, because Antigonus had led the Silver Shields, who had been at the heart of a lot of mutinies, and apparently Antigonus hated mutinies more than most generals, which is saying a lot. So Antigonus was burned to death. Antigonus seems to have been very charismatic, had a good sense of humor, and he and Demetrius enjoyed a very close father-son relationship. One time, Demetrius was late getting somewhere, so Antigonus stopped by to visit his tent, and when he came in the room, he saw a woman running out. And then when Demetrius tried to explain why he was late, he said, "Yeah, I've had a fever. I haven't felt so good." "Oh, I saw your fever running out the back." So, Antigonus, pretty easygoing guy, liked to drink. One thing he had going against him throughout this period is because he was older and also prone to be fat, his physical condition and ability to lead in the field was declining year after year, whereas age was not as much of a factor for his contemporaries, most of whom were 10, 15 years younger, and also we have no evidence that they were fat. So this was definitely a problem for Antigonus, especially in his later years. By the time of the Battle of Ipsus, he had trouble standing and mounting a horse, and he was also over 80 by this point, so yeah, he's another guy kind of like Antipater. We have to imagine that had he been a decade or so younger, things would have been way different. That being said, because his son remained loyal and they were very close, his son was able to make up for a lot of his deficiencies, as did his nephews when they could stay loyal. He also was able to cultivate the loyalty of a number of really skilled people. Aristodemus comes to mind. He had Nearchus at his court who remained loyal. He almost had Eumenes for a while because he and Eumenes had a good friendship. But ultimately, of course, Eumenes went a different path. Antigonus came very close to uniting the whole empire, and if it hadn't been for the Battle of Gaza, where Ptolemy and Seleucus defeated Demetrius and then Seleucus opened up Babylonia, he was on the verge of invading Europe. He had been delayed considerably by Lysimachus and Cassander, but had he made it to Europe, his army would have been too big to stop, most likely. So he had to double back and defend his territory, and after that point, from around, say, 313 onward, he was still the preeminent power, but not the main guy. He lost the Babylonian War. We don't know any of the details, but that created Seleucus' empire, effectively. I have to give him an S. He had a pretty tall task. He rose a long way. He had every skill you would need to rule successfully. He established a dynasty. By the time that he died, he had an adult son and grandson who were willing and able to rule, even if his son, as we'll see, is a bit of a dumbass. So yeah, he did everything you could possibly ask him to do. The only real downside to Antigonus is that his generalship was only good and not great. But he always kept his eye on the prize, and he was able to defeat the Lytos the White of the world. Next up is Demetrius Poliorcetes, which translates to the Besieger. I suppose now he's most famous for his elaborate siege equipment and his failure at Rhodes, but that was a fairly minor incident in his career, all things considered. Demetrius was already alive when Alexander died, but he didn't come of age for another several years. And from a young age, he was a fierce warrior, although his mind for strategy was very limited. He was not his father's son in that regard, but while his father was alive and calling the shots, Demetrius was an effective field commander. He married Phila, and together they parented Antigonus II Gonatus, who then went on to found the Antigonid dynasty in Macedon. Demetrius is also famous for turning the Parthenon in Athens into a party space. And as we mentioned earlier, he was the guy responsible for history's first ever booty call, which didn't quite go the way he expected. So basically, it was just like a Tinder date. He had a flair for sieges, and he really enjoyed intricate machines. Apparently, he was very into mechanisms, gizmos, gadgets, and all that stuff. Most ancient aristocrats were bored by mechanical things. So in that sense, Demetrius was a little eccentric, actually. He invaded Greece during the Fourth War of the Successors in 308. One of his most famous battles was Gaza, where he lost to Ptolemy, and this opened up Babylonia to Seleucus. So it was a famous failure, but he was very young at the time. The battle was pretty closely fought. So he wasn't incompetent. He just got beaten. He fought in the Fourth War of the Successors, established an Antigonid presence in Greece that would ultimately lead to him holding the throne much later. He won the Battle of Salamis in Cyprus against Ptolemy's fleet. He defeated Ptolemy's brother Menelaus. After that victory, he thought himself a naval genius, so he sailed on to Rhodes to try to succeed where Attalus had failed. And he had a hopeless siege that he realized was not going to happen in 305. Ptolemy was sending supplies, men, and money. But supposedly, according to Plutarch, he persisted in the siege because his personal honor was offended by the fact that Ptolemy had intercepted his mail to Phila. So because his honor was undermined, he kept on with the siege for another year and accomplished nothing. He also had a mistress named Lamia, who everyone around him hated. So she was basically the Camilla of his life. Supposedly, one time his ambassadors went to Lysimachus's court, and Lysimachus liked to show off the scars he had taken from fighting a lion. And Demetrius' ambassador said, well, Demetrius has scars from a much more savage beast called a Lamia. Anyhow, at the Battle of Ipsus in 301, Demetrius squared off against Seleucus' young son Antiochus, who was maybe 20 at the time, and he routed the left flank of that army. And this would have been a great deed for the Antigonids, except that Demetrius overpursued Antiochus, and while he was gone, Seleucus was able to set up his elephants as a screen to prevent Demetrius from coming back, and using the superior mobility that Seleucus and Lysimachus had, they were able to surround and destroy Antigonus' infantry, and this is where Antigonus died. And when I say destroy, most of them surrendered because, again, these are the wars of the successors. These men are not willing to fight to the death in a civil war. They'll put up a good fight, but when the outcome is clear, it's time to switch sides and fight for somebody else. As long as the pay is there, it's all good. Demetrius also later invaded the Peloponnese, and he became the first ever person in history as an outsider to capture the city of Sparta. A lot of other people could have done it. The city was unwalled, but they had never dared because they assumed the Spartans would get really desperate and it would be a bloodbath. Demetrius actually occupied the city proper. And after that, of course, Sparta invested in city walls. He intervened in the Antipatrid Civil War on behalf of one of Cassander's sons, and then after that guy won, he tried to send Demetrius home, but Demetrius attended a banquet and had him killed, and then took over part of the kingdom, divided it with Pyrrhus. In 294, ruled until 288. Apparently, he was a very terrible king. He did not answer any petitions for a long time, and then a woman pointed out that he was being a shit king, so he decided to start answering petitions, and he went overboard with it. And people still were not convinced he was a good king, though. He raised a massive army using exorbitant taxes. So he raised a massive army and fleet. He was planning on making a major gambit, but this incurred a lot of unpopularity. And so when Pyrrhus and Lysimachus invaded, when he went out to meet them, a lot of his army just defected because they were sick of Demetrius. He had 11,000 men who stayed with him, and then he made a desperate plunge into Lysimachus's Asia. This had been where his father's stronghold had been, and he figured there was some residual loyalty. However, Lysimachus' son Agathocles was able to contain him. And the strategy actually made a lot of sense, I think, because what else was he going to do? Macedonia was sick of him. So he tried to get something going, but Agathocles denied him battle. And then he crossed the Taurus Mountains into Seleucus' realm, and also sought a decisive battle where he thought that if he could just beat Seleucus, a bunch of men would defect to him and he'd be back on. But Seleucus also denied him battle, and then Seleucus presented himself to Demetrius' men and offered food, and they surrendered. Demetrius was then kept on an estate, and he basically ate and drank and hunted himself to death. Died in the year 283 at the age of 54. His son, Antigonus II, of course, had to pick up the pieces and a bunch of scattered garrisons in Greece, and eventually managed to create Antigonid Macedon. Demetrius is a fascinating guy. One of my personal favorites, but he's a D. He really was not that impressive as a ruler. He also was a poor strategist, and I feel like he really could have done a lot more than he did. Next up is Asander, the governor of Lydia from 334 to 329, who then came back and entered the area later. He was in the Indian campaign after the termination of his initial governorship, and then he was restored to Lydia in the 319 settlement, so he basically ended up where he had been 15 years before, which, given that he was a pretty minor figure, is not that bad. When Antigonus I became general of Asia, he decided to revolt, and he tried to join up with the European power, who I think at this time was Cassander. However, he was held in check effectively by Ptolemaeus, the nephew of Antigonus, and then Antigonus arrived with his main force in 313. He surrendered because he had no chance, and then when Antigonus humiliated him in some unknown way, he decided to revolt. And when he did that, Antigonus crushed him, and he probably was killed in action or executed. Pretty boring career, all things considered, but he actually was somewhat powerful as the satrap of Lydia. I'll give him an E tier. Clearly underperformed, but given how Antigonus liked the sideline people, I do understand why he revolted when he did. He apparently did not wait until an opportune moment, however. Next up is Antigonus's traitorous nephew, Ptolemaeus, also known as Ptolemy in some sources. Not to be confused with the important Ptolemy. He's first attested as a general in 315, the Third War of the Successors. He prevented Cappadocia from defecting to Cassander, and then, of course, he had to deal with Asander. He had to defend the coast against the Ptolemaic fleet, which was currently under Seleucus. He went to Greece in 313 after another of Antigonus's nephews, Telesphorus, or however you say his name, had defected. Ptolemaeus was able to take most of the island of Euboea right off the coast of Attica, one of the richest farmland areas in Greece. It literally means the good land, or land that is well, I guess if you want to be super literal. He won over the Athenians, but with threats, and then marched into the Peloponnese, and he offered freedom to the Greeks, so he offered people to overthrow their garrisons and be free and autonomous. The Macedonians really didn't want that, but if it gets your rivals out of position, it's all good, I guess. So he created a lot of damage, but he was contained by Craterus, and also he did not eliminate Polyperchon, even though Polyperchon was such a minor power that no one cared. In 310, Ptolemaeus defected to Cassander, but then Polyperchon also joined him, so you might think that Ptolemaeus had become a senior figure for Cassander and his sort of guy in the Peloponnese. Because Craterus was a woman, and let's face it, with the social mores of the time, no matter what she achieved, she would never be super senior. So Ptolemaeus thought that because he was bringing over a bunch of troops, that he would really become the man. And then Polyperchon defected, and he's got all the seniority, and he's an ex-region of Europe. So, yeah, that ended up being a bad move. So he waited a little bit longer, and then in 309, just a year after he had defected to Cassander, Ptolemy started making rumblings about invading Greece. So Ptolemaeus decided to meet Ptolemy on an island and discuss becoming his man in the Peloponnese. However, Ptolemy wanted nothing to do with his namesake and decided to have him seized and executed because the guy was a known traitor and he wanted to eliminate this guy and also send a message to all of the various would-be dynasts in the Peloponnese. As we mentioned earlier, this was enough to convince Craterus to surrender to Ptolemy. So his main purpose was to help out his namesake and rival in acquiring a foothold in Greece. Despite the fact that Ptolemaeus was a traitor and clearly someone who may have been a bit unstable and not a good strategist, I'm going to go with C tier because this guy clearly had quite a bit of ability and his incredible... No, I'm going to go down to D, sorry. I'm going to D. He clearly had ability, but clearly he didn't have a lot of constancy. So I feel like that's a major problem, and because he couldn't find a cause and stick with it, I don't think he was ever going to be ultra successful. Clearly he was looking for a time where he could then revolt and create his own thing, and no one trusted him. Alright, we'll do Aristodemus in just a second. Let me get another drink. My throat's a little parched. Okay, let me check the stream, make sure everything's still going. Let's see. Alright, everything's still good. Okay, next up, Aristodemus of Miletus. He was an Asiatic Greek, and possibly, if you think about it overall, I would say he's Antigonus' best general. Yes, better than Demetrius. He was the main Antigonid general in the Peloponnese during the Third War of the Successors because two of Antigonus' nephews had defected, but Aristodemus remained loyal, and also he was effective. When Ptolemaeus revolted, he had troops under his command, but Aristodemus was able to contain him. He then became the guy who was responsible for helping out Polyperchon, and he raised 8,000 mercenaries for him. It's unclear exactly what Polyperchon achieved with these men, but because it's Polyperchon, I assume it wasn't much. Along with Alexander, son of Polyperchon, the two of them were trying to undo the damage from Ptolemy's fleet, but then Alexander defected to Cassander. So then he had to contain Alexander. And the way that he did it was to turn to the new Aetolian League for help, and the two of them were able to contain Alexander. It appears that this operation made Alexander somewhat unpopular, and that may have led to his murder in Sicyon in 314. After this, it's not clear exactly what Aristodemus was up to, but as an Antigonid loyalist, he was a very, very good subordinate general, and he was able to navigate a very tricky situation in Greece where people were defecting left and right, back and forth. So I got to go with an A. And this is a limited sample size, keep in mind, so it's possible that he wasn't that impressive in the rest of his career, but our sources are fragmentary, and again, the main source is Diodorus Siculus, who is often sparing when it comes to details. Next up, we have a dynast who emerged who was neither Greek nor Macedonian in the strict sense. Philetus of Pergamon. He was born in 343, so he did not participate in the campaigns of Alexander. His father was either Macedonian or Greek, and his mother was Paphlagonian. It appears that he got his start under Antigonus I when he was the governor there, and he selected Philetus to become the new governor of Pergamon. Before the Battle of Ipsos, he defected to Lysimachus, most likely because Lysimachus controlled his part of Paphlagonia. This proved to be a wise move, as Lysimachus was the victor in the battle and then annexed the area. He kept his job under Lysimachus. Later on, when Agathocles revolted, he decided to side with Agathocles, and that proved to be a problem because Agathocles lost, So Philoterus fled to Seleucus's court. One of the things Philoterus was responsible for was keeping a 9,000 talent treasury. So effectively, he negotiated with Seleucus where he would achieve independence once Seleucus conquered Lysimachus in exchange for the contents of the treasury. And Seleucus, of course, won and abided by the deal. Interestingly, Antiochus also abided by the deal after his father's murder, but most likely that's because he was not in a position to do anything about it. So, for the cost of 9,000 talents, Philoterus bought a kingdom. And Pergamum would go on to build some pretty impressive stuff. They had a library. They had the mausoleum. Or is that... That's a Pergamon, right? Am I making that up? The library... There was... Not a library, but there's a great mausoleum at Pergamon, right? Hello? Pergamon? That's the mausoleum. I'll assume it is. No one's responding, so... Alright. Or somebody's responding right now. Whoa, whoa, whoa. I hate touchpads. Okay. So. I'm gonna look that up real fast. It's bothering me. Sorry to get sidetracked, but sometimes things like this get under my skin. Whoa. No. God damn it. Alright. I've been doing this a while. I'm tired. Somebody else do it. Great altar at Pergamon. Okay. Halicarnassus. There we go. It's Halicarnassus. I'm sorry. That was a mess up on my part. Okay. Never mind. Anyway, still an impressive city. Impressive civilization. Had a lot of money. Slowly expanded over time. His successors were able to expand. Pretty cool. They're called the Attalid Dynasty. Pretty good stuff. I think he's a solid B. I would go higher for founding Pergamon. The problem is that he literally had to buy his kingdom, although it was a worthwhile investment. So good for him. Next up is another dynast who was not well connected with the Macedonian court. Actually, not connected at all. This is Zapoites I of Bithynia. Zapoites was neither Greek nor Macedonian. He was a Thracian. And his achievement was to unite the Asiatic Thracians into the Kingdom of Bithynia. He tried to expand in the Greek areas, but he was often halted in his attempts. Antigonus I was able to check his advances in 315, so he waited until after Antigonus' death in 301 and tried again. He had a capital city called Zapoidium, which is now lost, and his main project was Hellenizing the Thracians. The typical narrative about how Hellenization worked is that a bunch of Greek colonists would come in and build new polis and then integrate all the aristocrats into Greek customs. And while that's true of Egypt and the Seleucid Empire, clearly here it's a case of the Thracians self-Hellenizing. And Zapoites was the architect of that. So it's a very interesting achievement, and it's a unique one. He survived multiple invasions from Antigonus, Lysimachus, and Antiochus I before his death in 278. And that's a pretty hardcore lineup of opponents to have to deal with. That being said, Bithynia is pretty rugged terrain, and the Thracians are a warrior people. So it's not super surprising that he was able to pull this off, especially when none of those guys was able to exert their full force against him. Bithynia was never as great as Pergamon, but Zapoites was able to set up his own empire, and that's pretty impressive considering that he literally created it out of thin air. So I'll go with B tier for him as well, and with both him and Philoterus, I could even see a case for A. Next up is the General of the East, one of the bodyguards, Python, represented here by Cobra Commander. I don't know why, I just thought it would be funny. Don't worry about it. I know some people have commented that we should just call him Python regardless of pronunciation because it sounds cool. I'm sympathetic to that view, but I'm just going to go with Python because I'm pretty sure that's correct. Anyway, Python was the senior general in the east. He was at Media, which was a very wealthy and strategically placed satrapy. He was within striking distance of Babylon, but also within easy reach of the eastern satrapies. When the Greek mercenaries in Bactria revolted and tried to march home, he was responsible for intercepting 20,000 of them. Python had a plan to get them to surrender and then use them as his army to batter his way west to power, but Perdiccas sent secret instructions to make sure that his men knew to execute these men. So Perdiccas did weaken Bactria ultimately by doing this, in a way, although of course the remaining mercenaries knew they had to stay, but ultimately he effectively cock-blocked Python. Python should not have let himself get outmaneuvered that way. He should have seen that coming, or at least anticipated that difficulty. But apparently he was fairly open about his intentions to integrate all these guys, and he got outmaneuvered. Later on, Python was still the strong man of the East, and he tried to impose his authority over the satrap of Perseus, Peucestus, who was a fellow bodyguard. And Peucestus was then able to go build a coalition with Subertius, Eudamus, and a lot of the other guys in the east, and together they inflicted a defeat on Python. That would have been fine and well, except that then Eumenes came east, pursued by Antigonus, and they also managed to drag Seleucus and Babylon into the fray. So then Python found himself as a subordinate of Antigonus. And while Seleucus was able to justify going home, Python was forced to fight at Peridicene and also at Gabiene. He didn't do all that well, and clearly it wasn't really his cause anymore. He was on the winning side and was initially rewarded, but effectively ended up in Antigonus's orbit. After Antigonus killed a lot of his opponents, Python thought that they were cool. And so Python was summoned to Antigonus's court a couple years later. He went, not suspecting anything, and he was killed. Python is an underachiever, to be sure. I got to go with it's either a D or an E for him. I'm going to go with a D just because the level of competition was pretty high. I mean, he did underachieve pretty bad, though. Let's call it a D-. Alright, next up is Peucestus. He was one of the last guys to emerge as a superstar in Alexander's campaigns. As I mentioned at the Battle of Multan, Alexander leapt over the walls recklessly, and Leonitus was trying to rescue him, and the next guy over the wall was Peucestus. So the two of them held off the Indians single-handedly until reinforcements could arrive. Alexander and the kings before him had only had 7 bodyguards up to that point, but Alexander created a special spot just for Peucestus. And then Peucestus apparently became a suck-up. Alexander was trying to Medize the Macedonians to some extent to win over the Persians culturally, and maybe create a kind of Macedonian-Persian ruling class, because he would need a lot more people to have a full army and also enough administrators to govern this massive empire. And Peucestus was 100% on board, whereas a lot of these other guys were not. And this may have offended a lot of them. Peucestus then got the province of Perseus, which is the place which was the Persian homeland. And because he was a Medizer, this was like the best assignment he could possibly hope for. Perhaps he was on good terms with Perdiccas, I would think. He was fairly capable, and clearly his bravery is beyond doubt. Now, all these guys were brave, but this guy literally leapt over the walls of a city and fought against a horde basically by himself. I think Leonitus was shielding Alexander primarily, while Peucestus was out there fighting and cutting dudes down. So this guy's got balls of steel. Even if he is sucking up to Alexander, I mean, this guy he's not a bitch. Let's put it that way, okay? He led the eastern satraps against Python. Python had a larger force and also a more unified one, but Peucestus was able to get the W. And then he had to submit to Eumenes because Eumenes was really good at using Alexander's cloak and a lot of the symbology around Alexander to create this aura of command. Eumenes also made it all about himself by accusing one of the other satraps of treason, and this strengthened his hand with the rest of them who feared Peucestus. Peucestus, as a former bodyguard, was a bigger threat to their independence in the long run than Eumenes, so he was kind of brushed aside. That being said, he was never okay with Eumenes taking his thunder, and while he did his job at Prytacine, he bailed on Eumenes in the middle of the battle at Gabiene, and this led to Eumenes' defeat. Ultimately, he would have been better off being on the winning coalition and then betraying Eumenes later, however, because once he joined forces with Antigonus, effectively Peucestus became a court jester. He was just kept around at court, and he never got any assignments. And we don't really know what he did. I mean, we know that he wasn't executed, but Antigonus didn't trust him and wasn't going to use him for anything. So he just whiled away his time at court, and his prime years slipped past him. Because he bungled his opportunity so badly, I can't go very high. That being said, when he was acting independently, he did show some flair. He also seems to have maybe had a vision for setting up a new kingdom in the east. And by all the evidence, he's an okay general. So I'm actually going to be generous to Peucestus and go with a C. My initial impulse was to go with a D, but upon further reflection, I think that he clearly had some ability. He just never quite was able to achieve his potential. And also, just to once again pimp my Patreon, I'm working on an alternative scenario, and another guy who has a much different historical path is Peucestus. All right, moving on. Next up is Teutomus. Teutomus is the definition of someone who is a footnote in history. He was the co-commander of the Silver Shields from 321 forward alongside of Antigonus, who I forgot to include. I should have really put Antigonus on here. So actually what I'm going to do is, because they commanded the same unit, I'm going to rank them together and just talk about both of them. So first of all, Antigonus was a highly respected but junior officer. He was an older guy, and the Silver Shields loved him. He was kind of rough around the edges, but very loyal. And he also was pretty cynical. He was willing to serve under Eumenes, even though Eumenes was a Greek, because he realized, as he tried to explain to Teutomus, dude, if we work for Antigonus, he can pay us what he wants because we don't have anywhere else to go. With Eumenes, he knows he has to pay us well because otherwise, if we're getting paid the same thing, we'll clearly go serve under a Macedonian. So he was in it for the money, and this guy was cynical to the extreme, but also he did uphold Eumenes' cause, and his silver shields in battle were highly effective. It also appears Antigonus did a better job handling them than did Teutomus, not Eudamus. So after Gabiene, it was Teutomus who betrayed Eumenes. So what happened is that the infantry on Eumenes' side was victorious, but the cavalry and light troops on Antigonus' side were victorious. So you had a weird standoff, but the baggage, including the wives and families of the Silver Shields, was now in the hands of the Antigonids. So Teutomus realized that his men would want that stuff back. They would want their families back. All of the Silver Shields at this point are old men, and they don't want to lose what they've worked a lifetime to achieve. So he went to Antigonus and he said, how about this? I will hand you Eumenes in exchange for my men's baggage. And Antigonus, of course, says, sounds good to me. And the Silver Shields, when Teutomus came back to camp, were about it. They felt ashamed of it, but they were on board. So they arrested Eumenes, and even though they were ashamed of themselves, they turned him over, and he was killed. Another guy Teutomus betrayed was the guy who helped him get richer, Antigonus. And Antigonus was burned alive by Antigonus because he was a hardcore opponent, and the Silver Shields had shattered Antigonus' phalanx in 2 consecutive battles. Not to mention their role in a bunch of mutinies. Antigonus was very effective, but ultimately he was just a unit commander. He did help to enforce Eumenes' authority. I think because I have to balance this out, if I could separate them more, I would put Antigonus at a B and then Tutamus at a C. I guess in honor of Antigonus being burned alive, I'm going to go with the B. But just keep in mind that if Tutamus was separate, he'd be down at C. Next up is one of the eastern satraps, Eudamus. He was left with a satrap named Philip, and he was a subordinate officer based at Taxila in India. This is when Alexander was marching back through the Gedrosian desert. Philip died pretty early on in a mutiny, possibly started by Eudamus. And then Eudamus basically said, I'm the new satrap, and told Alexander this was the case. Alexander signed off, and so it was. He was depending on his neighbor King Porus for support in the early days. It was hard going, especially when Chandragupta Maurya arrived and started causing problems. The chronology of Eudamus' career is pretty confused. However, at some point, he overthrew and killed Porus. The reasons are not clear. Maybe Porus revolted, or maybe he betrayed Porus in some way. We don't know. We do know that when he came west, he had 120 elephants with him. It's not clear if he got them from Porus or whether he was beaten by Chandragupta Maurya and he was given these elephants as a compensation. Later on, Chandragupta would give 500 elephants to Seleucus, so it's possible that this was just his way of saying, thank you for the land, here's a gift to keep you happy, and away. I think most people assume Eudamus was a traitor, but we don't really have a firm grasp on the chronology of this period. 321, 318 in the east. So, at any rate, Eudamus ends up in the coalition under Pusestus, and he's a dominant player because he's got a lot of elephants. That being said, he doesn't have much in the way of infantry or cavalry, and once Eumenes arrives, his role is even lessened. A lot of the elephants are taken out in, I think, at Prytacini, so his prestige is lowered quite a bit more. And also, he nearly lost the battle because Eumenes was on the verge of winning a crushing victory, but it was Eudamus' struggles on the flank which required Eumenes to double back. So, Eudamus didn't do super hot in that battle. He did remain loyal and fought bravely at Gabiene, but he ultimately was on the losing side. As I mentioned, the non-infantry battle favored the Antigonids, so Eudamus was once again defeated. And after the battle, Antigonus had him executed on the spot, along with Antigenes. Eudamus was a guy who was not very well positioned, so he created his own luck. He probably seized the throne, or not the throne, but the satrapal authority. And even though he was defeated in some way, he somehow got war elephants, even though he's a pretty junior, unimportant guy. And while he does not seem to have been a very good general, the fact that he was able to make himself a player from nothing, I think is worthy of a C. Although I could easily see a D for him. On my notes I say C or D. I decided to go with the C. Just being generous to an elephant man. Next up was another guy from the frontier, Subertius. Or wait. Okay. I messed this up a little bit. No, it's fine. Okay, this guy right here, this is the new Tutamus. I actually did it right. This is Antigenes, this is Tutamus. And this is Eudamus here with the elephant. Okay, we're back on track. Okay, now, the last of the eastern satraps is Subertius. Unlike his colleagues, he was a Greek and not a Macedonian. He governed on the eastern frontier at Arachosia. Originally, he was appointed to Carmania, but then he took over Arachosia and Gedrosia when his neighbor died. He kept a low profile, but after the fall of some of the other border provinces, he became the eastern border with Bactria. In 318, he sided with Pusestus and helped to defeat Pithon. But then when Eumenes joined, Eumenes built up his credibility with the other satraps by accusing Suburtius of treason and of corresponding with Antigonus. It's possible that it's true that Suburtius was in correspondence with Antigonus, but most likely Eumenes just made this up because he knew that Suburtius, as a Greek, was more vulnerable than a Macedonian. So he was the soft target. Suburtius had to flee the camp, removing his men, and later on he did indeed side with Antigonus. After Gabion, Antigonus rewarded Suburtius by confirming his position and sending the silver shields to him. His secret task was to use them up in small batches and make sure that they all were dead. So Suburtius was effectively given the task of killing off the survivors of arguably the most elite unit in history. And it looks like he did it, too. That being said, he clearly held the frontier. He was still in power in 303. Apparently, he played host to Seleucus' ambassador and historian Megasthenes, who then traveled to the east of India. Suburtius was able to hold on in a fairly rough area with a fairly minimal number of troops. He was given the silver shields, who were hard to handle, and somehow did it. I wish we knew more about this guy. I'm going to go with a B for Suburtius. He's a pretty impressive dude. Next up, we have a very obscure individual by the name of Ptolemy. Ptolemy, the first Soter, earned his name by helping the island of Rhodes against the ambitions of Demetrius. He was assigned to Egypt early on and never left. He was a bodyguard of Alexander, about 10 years older, so very well positioned throughout this period. He also has played a prominent part in the later histories, not only because he was a major player in all the wars of the Successors, but also because he wrote a memoir about Alexander's campaigns, so we know a lot about Ptolemy, and he founded a kingdom which ended up being the longest lasting of the Hellenistic kingdoms. He was a close friend and companion of Alexander, and he was a pretty skilled administrator, although I will argue he was not a good general. However, he was a good strategist overall, just not good as a field commander. Another thing he had going against him is that Egypt was weak in Greek and Macedonian troops, and after an abortive rebellion by the Egyptians, Ptolemy and his successors decided not to arm natives, so his manpower pool was always limited, but he always had a lot of money and a large fleet. In many ways, he tried to reproduce the strategy of New Kingdom Egypt. He tried to advance overland into either Palestine and Syria, or sometimes into Cilicia. He also tried to use his fleet to establish power in the Aegean Sea. Or not necessarily the Aegean, but the Eastern Mediterranean as a whole. He also would send money to create revolts to keep his rivals divided. In many ways, his decision to steal the body of Alexander started the First War of the Successors and helped to badly undermine Perdiccas. One of his most controversial decisions, and one which was very much in line with Lysimachus's decision, is that he too, as an old man, fell prey to the wiles of a younger woman. His second wife convinced him to eschew his first and oldest son in favor of his second son. In the case of Ptolemy, however, it's not a case of him being a senile old man, but rather that Ptolemy II was clearly more capable of ruling. Ptolemy Craterus was a bit unstable, as we'll see. So his older son was exiled and his 26-year-old son took over. Ptolemy also seems to have retired for a year or two before he died. So maybe he learned from Aristobulus, I don't know. So anyway, Ptolemy created a long-lasting kingdom. He expanded a little bit west. He expanded sometimes into the Near East, but would then get repelled. He set up Seleucus for success. He took him on as an admiral, then let him loose after Gaza. Ptolemy had all the skills of a monarch. That being said, the lack of military skill was a major problem. And I feel like as an ex-bodyguard and someone who always had a strong base, he should have been able to carve out a bigger kingdom. Especially given that he had a corner pocket position and a ton of money. Not to mention constant revenue. A lot of the guys he was facing had to rely on windfalls from treasuries. He had actual revenue coming in. I want to give Ptolemy an S just because he founded Ptolemaic Egypt, but I'm going to go with an A instead. But keep in mind, we're talking about like the highest possible A. This is an A+. If an S tier is basically 100, then he's about a 98. Last but not least is Seleucus, the first Nicator. What a loser, right? Just kidding. He started out as Perdiccas' deputy. He was not a bodyguard, and he was not very senior. He had just started to rise through the ranks when Alexander died, and he was beginning to be recognized as a capable guy. Most likely, he was a few years younger than Alexander, which is part of why he was not more senior. A lot of the guys Alexander was good friends with were 3 to 4 years older. Seleucus was the opposite. He's probably 3 to 4 years younger. So this meant that he was not as high up on the promotion list. Perdiccas kept him around as a deputy because he wasn't senior enough to be a threat, but he was capable enough to be useful. He helped betray Perdiccas, of course, sided with Antigonus I against Eumenes. He had inherited Babylonia, which was a rich and important province but without many troops. Then he's basically forced out by Antigonus and flees to Ptolemy, serves as an admiral, helps plan the Battle of Gaza, and then reinvades Babylonia. Now, he had a lot of local support because he's a popular governor and apparently a very charismatic guy. He didn't have a lot of troops, though, and then Antigonus managed to make peace with all of his opponents after Seleucus had invaded the interior. And so people like Ptolemy were thinking, Seleucus will buy us time to recover, Antigonus will weaken himself, then we'll be able to win the next war. But instead, Seleucus somehow managed to win the war and detach the entire east from Antigonus. Unfortunately, we do not have an account of that war. But Seleucus clearly won, and not only won Babylon, but also everything to the east. So Antigonus' empire was considerably truncated by a war with just one guy. Antigonus was still pretty much the man, but Seleucus now had a nice corner pocket position. When he was trying to consolidate the east, he did lose some land to Chandragupta Maurya, but he did manage to get 500 elephants out of it. And this now meant that he was considered the elephant general. Apparently Demetrius disparagingly called Seleucus the elephant keeper or something like that. So Seleucus was able to slowly but surely expand his realm. At the Battle of Ipsus, he gained a lot of Eastern Asia Minor. He also was able to oust Ptolemy from a lot of Syria. He then founded a bunch of cities which helped to consolidate his position, including the city of Antioch, which was named after his father. He also founded Seleucia on the Tigris, which was a major center in antiquity. And generally very successful, great state builder. His son Antiochus grew up to be a capable guy, and he entrusted Antiochus with the East. Later on, he fought a war to the finish against Lysimachus. These two old men were fighting in 281. Seleucus had held up a lot better over the years, won the war, and was in a position to conquer all of Macedon and Greece and then move on to Egypt, where there's no way that Ptolemy II could hold out against this massive force. But of course, he was murdered by a man he had taken in as a refugee, Ptolemy Craterus, who ironically was arguably the savior of his house. Although it didn't benefit him, he took over in Macedon as king, and then he got killed in battle by the Celts, and ultimately Antigonus II became king. But, Seleucus, I think, very, very easy S tier. The Seleucid Empire was the largest and most important of the successor kingdoms. Most of his heirs, down to maybe about the 5th or 6th generation, were pretty capable. And while they did have a lot of erosion in the east, it was because they were obsessed with the west. And after Antiochus Epiphanes, they didn't really produce too many other important or impressive figures. But that is not Seleucus' fault. Anyhow, that is my tier ranking of the successors. Let me know what you think, and maybe I'll interact with the chat for a little while. See what's going on. Alright, Let's see. Man, my throat is parched. Yeah, what stopped Seleucus was the spear of Ptolemy Carinus. Yeah, let's see. Anybody have anything I need to respond to? Seleucus for God tier. How can Lysimachus be better than Ptolemy? Generalship. Let's see. Oh, keep in mind also, I have a whole series with all these guys in detail. So if I missed out on anything, it's already on this channel. You just got to look for it a little bit. And quick announcement. I'm doing another live stream with Sean on Sunday at 10 o'clock p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And we will be comparing the careers of Voroshilov and Himmler as generals. Probably the two most incompetent generals of World War II. So be excited for that, and then we'll just hang out and talk with the chat. So if you guys want to hang out on Sunday night, be there. Alright. What are my standards for the rankings? Combination of the skills one needs to rule, so military skills, administrative skills, ability to work with people, diplomacy, success, ability to pick up subordinates who are capable, ability to deal with unexpected setbacks, longevity, which isn't fair, but it is what it is. I mean, if you live longer, obviously you're going to have a much better chance at winning. And a lot of it I did base relatively because a lot of these guys were not well positioned, but they still accomplished stuff, whereas other people were well positioned and underperformed. And I mean, yeah, I think we're all going to disagree about these guys, and partly I think it's because we have to do a lot of speculation with the successors because of the state of the sources. So it's a little bit of a challenge, and we have to kind of try to separate, to some extent, what could have been from what ended up happening. I think a lot of these guys got unlucky. Like, Craterus should have gone a lot further than he did. And Leonitus, too. Yes, Ptolemy Carinus was killed by the Celts, who then went on to sack Delphi. That was him. I say the Seleucid Empire is more important simply because it was more innovative. And also, it gave rise to other kingdoms, including the Parthians, the Greco-Bactrian kingdom, and an independent Judea came out of it too. So, whereas Ptolemaic Egypt really just kind of preserved in amber that sort of post-New Kingdom Egyptian standard, just under a Greek ruling class. Although, of course, the library at Alexandria was extremely important. I haven't really looked a lot into Mithridates the Sixth yet. I'm sure I will. I'm planning, one day I'm going to do sort of a series on the great opponents of Rome. So Mithridates the Sixth is obviously one of the guys you got to talk about there. And I also plan on eventually going more into the, say Antigonid, Macedon, the Seleucids, and the Ptolemies. But it'll be a little while before I do that. Like I said, I believe that Lysimachus had some sort of a breakdown. I think that, I don't think he was in his right mind, because if you look at his strategy, apparently he sat pat with his army for about 6 months without moving, which, just from a sanitation and logistics perspective, is bad, and also it's really bad for morale. And that's not a Lysimachus thing to do. So I think there was something off. He had lost his way, either mentally or maybe he was just suffering from dementia. I don't know. But I mean, obviously, Ptolemy had a more lasting achievement than Lysimachus. But if Lysimachus had had a stronger area at an earlier point, I think that he would have been a lot more successful than Ptolemy was. I have not been smoking blunts. I've been drinking coffee, and Usually that's part of why I let Sean talk as much as he does, because I get my voice blows out pretty easily. Um, let's see. Probably go pretty soon. I'm going to eat dinner. Okay, my ultimate favorite out of all these guys. All right, so I really like Lytos the White. A lot. I don't want to say he's my favorite, but I really like him. Antigonus is really cool. I'm a big fan of him. Uh, I don't really. I think my least favorite is probably Lysimachus. Actually, I find him kind of boring, but I will acknowledge his abilities. Um, Cassander, I think, is underrated. I'm not necessarily a big fan, but I do defend him because I think a lot of people underrate him. I guess I'd have to go with Seleucus, which I guess is the basic answer, but and look at what he achieved. Look at the Babylonian War. Just for the Babylonian War alone, I gotta go with Seleucus. And also, he really set up a lot of the major cities of the East that were dominant for centuries. So he's pretty cool. I don't know. I don't think Demetrius is overrated. No, underrated. Excuse me. I think Demetrius was powerful and he's very interesting, but he's not much of a strategist. As far as future tier list, I'm not sure. I'm sure I'll do one eventually. This one took a while to put together because it's been a couple years since I looked at a lot of this stuff. If I do another one soon, it'll probably be Roman Republic or something like that. So it's something I'm pretty familiar with, and it's a little more recent, so it'd be not that hard. But I'll probably do it in micro chunks. Julius Caesar biography, I am thinking of doing that. I'm trying to figure out how many parts I'm going to make it. But that is something I have been planning. So I do have some notes on that. And I've been reading Christian Mayer's Caesar biography. Yeah, so what I'd do for that is maybe like the generals of the Second Punic War, or the major figures of the Second Punic War, or whatever it might be. I'll try to do something specific so that way it's a all the people are operating in the same context, so it's a comparable field. Although I have also thought about trying to do like a tournament of incompetence, where it's all the people from the tier list we've done who really sucked, and then they're put in the random competitions with one another, where we have to gauge who would win of all these people who are completely inept. And there's only a few Hellenistic kingdoms though. That would be a pretty short one. Aurelian, I'm sure I'm going to get him eventually. I'm not really interested in the current ethnopolitics of Macedon versus Greece. It's I feel like it doesn't really match up with the ancient debate. I think the ancient debate was very much more self-serving. It was really a debate of, okay, we Macedonians are Greeks when you're calling us a barbarian. I mean, we're part of your culture. But when it's time to divide the spoils of the empire, now there's a difference, okay? Because we want all the spoils and you don't get shit. So I'm pretty sure that divide between the Macedonians and the Greeks is, in the ancient world, they're culturally similar. There's a little bit of a difference because of geography, and they did have a different accent or whatever, maybe even a different dialect, but they're basically just the northern extremity of the Greeks at that time. And things have changed since then. Obviously, the dynamics and the demographics of the Balkans have changed. I don't really care who is the true inheritor of Hellas. I would argue that everyone in the West can claim the heritage of Hellas, because it's influenced all subsequent thought. So, not really concerned about bloodlines and all this other horse shit. It's pretty meaningless. Oh, Cassander's tactics versus Ptolemy's strategy. Yeah, that could be a good one. All the enemies of Rome, yes. Greek philosopher tier list, maybe. I'd rather lay them out in more detail first, and also I don't really know if they compare with one another in terms of value. I think that they're all pretty valuable in terms of what they contribute. So I'm not sure if that would be quite appropriate to compare them in that way, unless it's just based on like which ones do I like the most. I do have a degree in history. I'm about to finish my PhD, so I do this a lot in a number of different capacities. Researching, teaching, and whatever this is. Enemies of Rome, yep. Would I be a successor general? Maybe, I don't know. I mean, I guess if I knew somebody like Alexander, I guess I could be a successor general. Yeah, I mean, if I did enemies of Rome, it'd have to be divided by period, because obviously there's a lot of them. And Rome was around for a long time, so it'd have to be within different time frames. But in terms of Cassander's tactics versus Ptolemy's strategy, I'd have to go with Cassander's tactics, because he often faced annihilation from stronger forces and still held out. My thesis is about the military contributions of elite Athenians and how that worked within the larger context of Athenian democracy. It's not that exciting. It's difficult to compare the Samnites and Carthaginians and Persians, but I guess you can do it. You just got to be creative. These guys today, I don't know. I know a lot of the founding fathers would be poor politicians today because they don't have the kind of social skills you need. The successors, however, had a lot of charisma, so I think they might be able to translate into any period as long as they could stop murdering each other. They also had a lot of general military ability, so I think they could be successful in a lot of different contexts, actually. I don't think we know much about Caesar's time as... Actually, Caesar was never tribune, I'm pretty sure. To be tribune, you had to be plebeian. Caesar was patrician. The best ruler, general, and man. Okay. The best ruler, in terms of ability to govern... Cassander, Ptolemy, Seleucus are all in the running for that. Maybe Antigonus as well. I don't know which would be the best. Best general, I have to go with Seleucus overall just because he was successful over a long period of time. And in terms of best man, I would have to go with Aristobulus because he was someone who always stuck by his word. He never betrayed anybody, and he always did what he said he was going to do. Would I hire one of them to be my life coach? I would definitely hire Lytos the White. I would hire him as my life coach for sure. I think he knew what he was doing. Romans versus the Greek kings. Yeah, that's an interesting period. I like that a lot. I'm sure I will get to that eventually. Yeah, actually, now that I think about it, if you think about right now how weak the presidential field is, almost any of these guys we talked about, just based on charisma alone, would be able to breeze to the presidency if they were a major party nominee. Even if they had some serious baggage. You know, like if they'd committed some massacres as generals in Afghanistan or Iraq, they would just breeze right through. Electoral landslide. Alright, I think I'm going to depart, and I'm going to go eat dinner. Sasanian history, I think I have done one on that before. I'm pretty sure I have a video up on that. It's been a while, but I think I have it. Anyway, guys, thank you for joining me, and hopefully I will see you all again on Sunday night. And yeah, I'll cover all the Romans eventually, so it's just a matter of time. All right. There's a big delay, too, between what I'm doing and what you're seeing, just so you know. All right, anyway, I will see you all later. Wait, I gotta go to the control center. There we go.